The morning of August 6, 1945, in Hiroshima, began like any other. The sky, clear and unblemished, bathed the city in a soft, golden light. The coolness of the morning air carried the delicate scent of dew upon the grass, mingling with the faint fragrance of early morning rice cooking in homes. The streets, though still quiet at first light, began to hum with activity as people went about their daily routines. Vendors set up their stalls, selling fresh vegetables, fruits, and fish. Children's laughter echoed as they played in narrow alleys, their carefree voices rising in the early morning warmth. The rhythm of daily life was steady, grounded in the simplicity of routine. You could almost feel the heartbeat of the city, slow, measured, and predictable. The distant sounds of a temple bell rang out, adding a sense of serenity to the morning, and the occasional chirp of birds perched high on telephone lines added an ethereal layer to the ordinary. As you walk the streets, everything seems as it should be. There is nothing that suggests that anything, not even the calm morning air, will remain unchanged. A flash so bright it rivals the sun itself erupts from the sky, and the peaceful morning evaporates in the blink of an eye. It is a light that cuts through the world like a blade, sharper than anything you could imagine, and in that one flash, everything is unmet. The suddenness of it is disorienting, so immense and overwhelming that it seems to steal the breath from your lungs. The warmth of the sunlight is eclipsed by the heat that follows, an unbearable blast of energy that rushes forward with a force that shatters windows, crumples buildings, and melts the earth beneath your feet. Then, as quickly as it arrives, the light disappears, leaving behind only a deafening silence. But this silence isn't peaceful. It is oppressive, thick with the absence of life and the sounds of destruction. The echo of the explosion reverberates across the city. But it is not just an explosion of sound, it's an explosion of everything. The vibrant, bustling city that once thrived is no more. In its place, there is only the quiet despair of rubble and the faint cries of those still alive. Everything you once knew, everything familiar, has been erased in an instant. The aftershocks of the explosion continue, but now they are not physical. They are felt deep within the soul, the unbearable weight of loss, the trauma that cannot be escaped, and the confusion that swells like the smoke rising from the burning city. To understand the magnitude of what occurred in Hiroshima, we must look at the historical and military context that led to such devastation. The atomic bomb, developed as part of the Manhattan Project, represented not only a technological breakthrough, but a shift in the nature of warfare itself. It was a weapon of unspeakable power, one that carried the potential to alter the course of human history. Imagine the cold, clinical approach of military planners and scientists who, in their effort to end the war, engineered a device capable of mass destruction. The decision to deploy such a weapon wasn't made lightly, but the justification was clear. Bring an end to the war with as little further loss of life as possible. The horrors of conventional warfare, with battles stretching across Europe and the Pacific, had taken a toll on both sides. Yet, even with the bomb, no one could predict the full impact on the lives and souls of those caught in its wake. The United States had unleashed a force more powerful than anything seen before, a force that didn't just wipe out military targets, but decimated entire cities, leaving entire populations in anguish. Hiroshima, a city of approximately 350,000 people, was chosen for the bomb's test, not because it was a military target, but because it had a significant industrial presence. However, the bomb did not discriminate between soldier and civilian. The world had not yet fully grasped the implications of nuclear power, what it meant for humanity, the future, and how it would change warfare forever. The residents of Hiroshima and later Nagasaki were the first to experience this new reality. No one could have known how the devastation of such an explosion would affect the survivors, physically or emotionally, in the days and years to come. As you think about the massive scale of the destruction, imagine the personal experience of the survivors, the people who walked away from the explosion, physically untouched by the immediate blast, would not escape unscathed. Their lives would never return to what they once knew. Imagine being one of these survivors, standing amidst the destruction, unsure of where to go or how to move forward. The world has shifted, and you find yourself surrounded by debris and ruins, your very identity wrapped up in the ruins of the place you once called home. These survivors were not just physically scarred, but emotionally and psychologically devastated. What does it mean to survive something so horrific? The immediate effects were obvious: burns, injuries, and shattered bodies, but the more lasting damage was often invisible. Survivors of the atomic bomb carried with them not just the physical burns from radiation, but the weight of emotional trauma, the loss of family, and the incomprehensible grief of what had just been taken from them. In the following segments, we will not only explore the physical impact, but also the deep psychological scars left by the bomb. These stories are about the resilience of humanity, the ability to rise from the ashes of devastation, and the lasting legacy of such an event. The survivors, the medical community, and the city itself would have to face an uncertain future. For the next several decades, Japan and the world would struggle to understand the full consequences of what had occurred. Now, as you close your eyes and reflect on those who survived that day, allow yourself to journey through their experiences. As you listen, imagine walking through the ruins of Hiroshima. Day streets that were once full of life are now a barren landscape of twisted metal and scorched earth. The buildings that once stood tall are now reduced to skeletons. There is an overwhelming quiet that seems to hang in the air. Yet, amid this silence, there are those who remain. There are survivors, just as there are always survivors, and their stories are what will follow. Before the cataclysmic events of August 6, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities like any other. They had their own rhythm, their own pulse that seemed to hum softly through the streets, much like any bustling city. It's the type of day you might not think twice about, the kind of day you would remember only for the small, ordinary details. In Hiroshima, the air was cool as the sun rose slowly, casting long, soft shadows on the neatly paved streets. Vendors were just beginning to set up their stalls, unpacking bundles of fresh produce and the day's catch for market. The sounds of their calls filled the streets, buy fresh fish, vegetables for your meals. Their voices carried in the quiet, early morning air. The city was a constant hum of movement. Children ran across the freshly swept sidewalks, laughing as they played, while the elderly sat at doorways, chatting with one another over tea, their eyes still heavy with the remnants of sleep. There was a palpable sense of routine in the air. The streets were filled with workers heading to the factories, prepared to work another long day. Others were gathering their belongings, preparing to leave for school or make the morning trek to the markets. Even the clink of the bicycles' bells as they passed by seemed to fit within this regular pattern. The city, for all its bustle, had a quietness to it that you could only find in places where familiarity has a comforting hold. You could almost hear the rhythm of life, where every sound felt like a reminder of how predictable the world was. But underneath the surface, there was anxiety. Japan had been embroiled in a brutal war for years, and everyone could feel the tension in the air. The war had touched everyone's life in one way or another, and yet, life had to go on. People had adapted to the uncertainty, had grown used to the sirens, the occasional air raids, the long nights of worry. But for most people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the daily life they led was as close to normal as they could allow themselves to believe. On that same morning, in Nagasaki, a similar scene unfolded. The city, nestled within steep hills and overlooking a harbor, was steeped in quiet beauty. The streets wound their way through dense residential areas, past fish markets where the scent of fresh seafood filled the air, mixing with the smell of bread and steamed rice. As in Hiroshima, life in Nagasaki was full of motion, though a little more subdued in its rhythm. As the city was smaller and quiet, the children ran down the narrow lanes, their feet kicking up the dust, laughing as they passed by. Street vendors selling sweets. The sounds of life echoed between the hills that surrounded the harbor, while small boats drifted along the water, their sails catching the morning wind. The tension of war was always palpable, but there was a quiet defiance in the people of Nagasaki. Life, despite the ever-present threat, had to continue. The factories hummed with activity as workers strolled in, ready to contribute to the country's war effort. Their labor was not just for the sake of survival, but for something much larger, an abstract sense of duty to their homeland. In both cities, people tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos of global conflict. Then, without warning, the world of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was changed forever. The suddenness of the event defies comprehension. The flash that erupted from the sky on August 6, 1945, was brighter than anything anyone could have ever witnessed before. It felt like the sky itself had torn open. People who were moments before walking, working, or talking, found themselves stunned by the sheer power of the explosion. The light was not just bright, it was pure, white, and all-encompassing, so overwhelming that it felt like time had stopped. Those within range of the blast were swallowed whole by the intensity of it. It was as though everything that ground beneath their feet, the buildings around them, the air they breathed was, suddenly and violently displaced. The shockwave that followed was no less terrifying. It came fast and furious, like a great wave crashing onto the shores of their lives. It tore through the city, flattening buildings, breaking glass, sending everything flying. For a moment, the air was thick with dust and smoke, the world reduced to a haze of debris. Imagine being caught in this moment. The roar of the explosion, deafening, vibrating through your entire body. The intense heat that immediately followed, burning everything in its path. People close to the epicenter were vaporized in the flash, leaving only shadows on the ground. Others were left struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The pain was immediate for many. Second-degree burns marked the skin of those closest to the explosion, while others faced third-degree burns that would later prove fatal. And yet, there was no time for grieving, no time to process. The city had been leveled, its familiar sounds of commerce and life completely wiped out in an instant. The overwhelming chaos of the moment cannot be overstated. As you imagine yourself moving through the city, there is no order, no plan, no sense of direction. People are stumbling over debris, gasping for air, not knowing whether to run, hide, or help. The only certainty is that their world had just been taken from them, and survival in its most basic form had become the only goal. In the immediate hours following the blast, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced a terrifying unknown. The city's infrastructure was obliterated. Streets that once teemed with life now felt empty, covered in a thick layer of debris and ash. The air was no longer clean, but thick with the smell of burning wood and flesh. The streets were flooded with the injured, their bodies scorched, their faces barely recognizable. For those who had survived, there was no relief. Hospitals were gone, medical staff had been killed or were themselves injured, and those left were simply too overwhelmed to assist. No one had any answers about what had happened, why it happened, or what could be done. Those who remained alive were left wandering through a city that no longer resembled the place they had called home. Imagine yourself as one of these survivors. You may not be physically injured, but you have seen the horrors unfold before your eyes. You may have lost loved ones, or worse, never found them. Your life, which once seemed certain, is now shrouded in doubt. Where do you go from here? What happens when the world you knew no longer exists? The immediate aftermath was not just physical, it was deeply emotional. Grief, shock, fear, and an overwhelming sense of confusion engulfed the survivors. For those who had lost family members or friends, the sense of loss was beyond words. The shock of the event left many unable to fully process what had happened. They moved in a kind of stunned silence, trying to figure out how to go on in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. And as the survivors began to rebuild, the emotional and psychological scars of the bombings lingered long after the physical ones began to heal. Imagine waking up in Hiroshima or Nagasaki on the morning of August 6, 1945, or August 9, 1945, depending on which city we focus on. The city is alive, but not in the way you might think of a war-torn, chaotic place. Instead, there is a natural, rhythmic calmness to the day-atypical morning, just like any other. In Hiroshima, the sun had just begun to rise, casting its soft, golden glow over the city. The streets, which had seen their fair share of military trucks and laborers, were beginning to fill with ordinary people, the quiet hum of life in motion. Vendors were arranging their wares on small wooden carts. Fresh vegetables, fish, and other daily necessities. The smell of rice cooking wafted from homes, a smell so comforting that it made the day feel like nothing out of the ordinary. As you walk the streets, the sound of children laughing and running through the alleys fills the air. As parents and neighbors stand chatting, their faces illuminated by the early morning sun. Even as war raged on, the streets of Hiroshima were filled with the mundane rhythm of everyday life. People hurrying to work, children in school uniforms heading to class, workers trudging to factories where they spent long hours on the war effort. The buzz of life so familiar and routine was all around. You could almost feel the city's heartbeat, a steady pulse, echoing the lives of its citizens. In Nagasaki, the morning unfolded similarly. The harbor buzzed with activity as fishing boats unloaded their daily catch, sending a tangy, salty breeze through the air. The hilly streets that wound their way through residential neighborhoods were peaceful, dotted with small cafes and local shops. Children's laughter echoed off the buildings as they dashed through the streets, while their parents made small talk with the neighbors. The atmosphere in the air was light, with a slight breeze carrying the smells of fresh seafood from the market. Both cities had a delicate calmness about them, despite the tension of living in a wartime society. People were familiar with the occasional air raid siren, a stark reminder of the ongoing global conflict. But this was there nor meld the reality of living in a war-ravaged world while trying to preserve some semblance of normalcy. Yet, despite the external signs of war, this was still a city filled with people living their lives. They savored their morning coffee, and went to the market, all of them navigating through the cracks of global conflict in order to preserve their sense of routine. But then, in an instant, everything changes. The serene, peaceful morning in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is shattered by something impossibly violent and unfathomable. In Hiroshima, the bomb falls without warning, and the city experiences an instantaneous shift. Everything familiar is ripped away in a moment of unimaginable force. The flash hits you first. It's so bright that it blinds you. Even if your eyes are closed, you can see it, feel it in the depths of your being. It's not just light, but heat, like an unrelenting furnace that has opened its mouth to devour the world. The flash is over in an instant, but its effects linger, its searing brilliance marking your vision, even after you can no longer see anything at all. This light, as it burns into the very air, is not just a physical sensation, it is almost spiritual in its intensity. It's as if the universe has folded upon itself, releasing a violent burst of energy. The heat is unbearable, an unrelenting furnace scorching everything in its path. And before there's time to think, the shockwave arrives. It's a deep, gut-wrenching roar that you feel not just in your body, but in your very bones. The ground beneath your feet shifts, the air rushes past you, and buildings around you collapse. There's no escaping it. Within seconds, the world as you know it is gone. The streets, once filled with vendors and people walking, are now reduced to rubble. Homes, shops, schools, parks, and even the places of worship are turned into nothing but ashes. Dust, debris, and fire fill the air. No matter where you turn, everything is either being destroyed or vaporized. The smell of burnt wood, flesh, and metal invades your senses. It's the kind of overwhelming stench that stings the nose, burns the throat, and lingers for hours after. There's no escape from it. The air around you feels thick with destruction, with death, with grief. In the immediate aftermath, the silence is as much of a shock as the explosion itself. There's no immediate recovery, no sudden burst of hope. Instead, there is only stillness, as if the entire city had held its breath and then forgotten how to exhale. The horrifying stillness is broken only by the faint sounds of people crying out, the occasional crackling fire, and the distant sound of the wind shifting through the charred remains of the landscape. And here lies the ultimate contrast. The quiet life of daily routines has vanished, replaced by a hellscape where survival becomes the single, overwhelming priority. The survivors, caught in the wake of the explosion, are not just physically battered, they are mentally shattered. The city that once held their world has now been completely obliterated. Imagine what it would feel like to look around and see nothing but ruins. Your sense of time warped by the intensity of the explosion. There is no longer a way to locate familiar places, or even identify what was once a bustling city street. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what were once the landmarks of everyday life are now twisted piles of stone, metal, and broken dreams. For the survivors, those lucky enough to still be alive after the blast, grief of loss is almost unbearable. The first instinct is survival, but that survival comes at a cost. There are burns, injuries, radiation, poisoning, and internal trauma that will follow for years to come. But the hardest part is the psychological toll. The sudden loss of everything familiar, your home, your loved ones, your sense of self creates a void. The immediate aftermath was a race against time. The survivors had to search for clean water, find places to take shelter, and deal with the unrelenting heat of burning debris and raging fires. But above all, they had to contend with psychological trauma. The emotional pain of having everything you knew taken away in the blink of an eye was compounded by the fact that the survivors had no frame of reference for understanding the kind of destruction they had just witnessed. And yet, in the face of this, life went on. Slowly, hesitantly, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began the painful process of rebuilding. But it was in just the cities that needed rebuilding. It was the hearts and minds of the survivors that would take the longest time to heal. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though physically rebuilt, would never fully recover from what had happened that day. As we reflect on the events that transpired in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the final question often remains: was the decision to use the atomic bomb justified? Did it bring an end to the war as quickly as promised? Or did it unleash a new kind of terror, one that still lingers to this day, felt not just in the cities themselves, but in every corner of the world that was impacted by the fear and uncertainty nuclear weapons created. The contrast between the world before and after the bomb is stark and undeniable. What once was a thriving city, full of ordinary people leading ordinary lives, is now a place where survival became an act of profound courage. It is a place where not just homes and buildings were lost but a way of life, a shared sense of community, and a sense of safety that had been taken for granted. The contrast between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before and after the bombings, couldn't be stopped. These cities, like any other urban center of the time, were filled with the ordinary hum of daily life. But the moments before the bomb dropped were filled with more than just routine. It was a snapshot of humanity's perseverance during a time of global conflict. In Hiroshima, the sunrise on the morning of August 6, 1945, heralded another day in a world at war. There was a softness in the air, typical of early morning in Japan, where the dew still clung to the grass and the birdsong greeted the waking city. The streets were already beginning to bustle with activity, vendors hawking fresh produce, shopkeepers sweeping the walkways outside their stores, and children hurrying along to school, their footsteps light and carefree. The world was not at peace, but it was still a world of life lived with purpose, with the rhythms of daily routines guiding people through their days. In Nagasaki, as dawn broke over the hills, the faint glow of the rising sun highlighted the winding streets and hills that the city was built upon. There was a familiar quiet hum as people readied themselves for work, catching the scent of fresh fish from the market or the tanks of salt in the breeze from the nearby sea. The gentle hum of conversation and the bustling sounds of busy workers filled the air. The streets not just a place for the exchange of goods, but a reflection of the community's life. But then came the flash, and the world these people knew was utterly transformed. The immediate explosion, a destruction unlike anything ever witnessed. The moment the atomic bomb detonated, the world itself seemed to fracture. The flash of light that immediately enveloped Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not simply a bright light. It was a violent eruption of energy that tore through everything it touched, leaving no room for understanding or escape. The flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, appeared without warning, and in that single moment, the landscape of the city was redefined. The physical destruction was instantaneous, and all buildings, homes, factories, temples, schools, and markets were obliterated in the blink of an eye. What had once been organized streets, filled with familiar landmarks, now lay in ruin. The very foundations of the city buckled under the force of the explosion, and structures that had once stood for decades were now nothing more than crumpled heaps of rubble. The sound that accompanied the explosion was unlike anything imaginable. There was no gradual crescendo, no warning, just an immediate all-encompassing roar that shook the earth, rattled every soul in its path, and ripped apart everything in its wake. It wasn't just the force of the explosion that shattered the city, it echoing with the relentless collapse of concrete, stone, and wood. The sound reverberated across the city, overwhelming the senses in a way that words can hardly express, and the subsequent shockwave tore through the streets with an eerie force, knocking people to the ground and ripping buildings from their foundations. Then came the heat, unlike anything humans had ever experienced before. It wasn't a gradual rise in temperature, it was an immediate blast of furnace-like heat that seemed to melt the very air. The temperatures reached hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit in mere seconds, vaporizing everything in sight, from human beings to buildings. What was once living, vibrant, and full of purpose was now reduced to nothingness, scorched earth. The heat was suffocating, pressing down on everything it touched, an invisible force that sapped life out of the city. The firestorm that followed was relentless. What was not destroyed in the initial explosion was consumed by waves of fire that spread across the city in an instant. The streets, once familiar, were now nothing more than torrid rivers of flame, devouring everything in their path. And above all of this, the overwhelming stench of burning flesh, scorched wood, melted plastic, and searing metal filled the air, a stench so pungent, it was like a physical weight on the senses. It was impossible to escape, no matter where you went. It followed you as you stumbled through the smoke and charred ruins, and it became a part of you. But amidst the devastation, the real tragedy lay not in the physical destruction alone, but in the human cost. The survivors, or hibakusha, those who lived through the explosion and endured the aftermath, were left not just with physical injuries, but with psychological trauma that would persist for the rest of their lives. Burns were the most immediate wounds. Third-degree burns covered the bodies of the survivors, their skin turning black as it melted away. In some cases, survivors were left with no skin at all, their flesh exposed and vulnerable to infection. Their eyes were often seared, leaving them blind or disfigured, their faces and bodies irreparably marked by the blast. But the scars left behind were not always visible. The most profound damage was often internal, from the radiation sickness that poisoned survivors in the weeks and months that followed, to the emotional trauma that crushed their spirits. The mental burden of surviving something so catastrophic is difficult to understand unless you have lived through it. Many survivors woke up to the cruel reality that their families were gone, their homes reduced to ash, and their cities now nothing more than graveyards of burnt-out husks. In the aftermath, those who survived the blast found themselves caught in a new kind of survival. The struggle to stay alive, not just physically, but emotionally. The first days after the bomb were filled with confusion and shock. As survivors stumbled through the city's wreckage, they tried desperately to find clean water, food, and shelter, but these essentials were now in short supply. The lack of clean water led to further suffering, as those who had been exposed to the heat and radiation could do nothing but wait, their bodies succumbing to illness and infection. Yet, the most agonizing part of survival wasn't just the physical pain. The survivors were left alone in the ruins, surrounded by the bodies of loved ones, with no way to process what had happened. There was no time for mourning. There was only survival. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities torn apart, their structures gone, their memories erased. The lives that had been lived there, the hopes and dreams that had once filled those streets, were now nothing but shadowed echoes. For many survivors, the pain didn't end with the immediate aftermath. They carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. The psychological scars, the guilt of survival, the haunting images of the explosion, and the overwhelming sense of loss would stay with them long after their physical wounds had healed. The survivor's journey became a path of carrying the weight of an impossible event, a traumatic chapter in history that had irrevocably changed them, and the world they once knew. The devastating effects of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just about the immediate destruction of buildings and infrastructure. The bomb wreaked havoc on the very souls of the survivors. The physical devastation left an entire generation struggling to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. The emotional trauma carried on through decades, impacting not just the immediate survivors, but also their children and grandchildren, who grew up in the shadow of their ancestors' experiences. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, a city with its own rhythm, filled with ordinary routines, was poised to experience the unimaginable. People went about their morning chores, just like any other day. There was the sound of children's laughter echoing down alleys as they raced to school, the rhythmic tap-tap of workers preparing for another day at the factories, and the murmur of conversation among neighbors exchanging pleasantries. The morning air was filled with the faint scent of rice cooking and the sweetness of blooming flowers along the roadside. Life, though marred by the ongoing war, seemed to persist in its usual form, a comforting and predictable routine, like the turning of seasons. In Nagasaki, the morning unfolded similarly, the quiet of the hills broken only by the soft whistle of wind through the trees and the low hum of distant voices from the market. The workers' footsteps echoed on the cobblestones as they moved through the narrow streets, and the sound of fresh fish being unloaded from the port was a familiar one. There was the taste of salt in the air, the scent of seawater mixing with the more traditional smells of street food and flowers. In these moments, one could be lulled into a sense of peaceful ordinariness, as the world kept turning in the midst of a devastating global war. The flash of the bomb, unimaginable destruction, the flash that preceded the atomic bomb's explosion, was not a simple burst of light. It was a searing, blinding force that seemed to tear through time itself. Those who witnessed it recall the sensation of their eyes being flooded with light, so intense that it seemed to burn the very air. It was as though reality had been erased for a fraction of a second, an all-encompassing, total annihilation of light. Survivors later described it as something that obliterated all sense of color and shape, a momentary dissolution of everything they knew. And then came the roar, a deep, almost earth-shaking rumble, the sound of which didn't just fill the city, but felt as if it came from deep within the ground, as if the earth itself had cracked open. It wasn't just the usual blast of an explosion. It was a shockwave that radiated outwards, reshaping the very physical world around it. Imagine this standing there on the streets of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, your body instantly overwhelmed by the compression of air, and then, almost immediately, a sharp, agonizing pain in your chest. It feels as though your body itself is being ripped apart, the sound of shattering and cracking filling your ears as buildings around you implode. The streets, once filled with familiar sights and sounds, are now consumed by a chaotic mess of falling debris and destruction. What had once been a city of life was now a devastated wasteland, and the survivors had no time to comprehend the enormity of what had just occurred. The immediate heat of the blast created a firestorm that spread with terrifying speed. Survivors later recalled the sensation of being burned alive as the intense heat seared their skin, hair, and clothing in seconds. The heat was so intense, so overwhelming, that it felt like an invisible force pushing against your body, forcing you to submit to it or be consumed. Buildings, trees, and people were vaporized instantly, caught in the ferocious energy unleashed by the bomb. As the fires raged, the streets that had once been familiar became unrecognizable. The buildings once homes, businesses, and schools now were reduced to charred skeletons, twisted metal, and crumbling brick. Glass and shards of concrete filled the air, and people had to move through the smoke and ashes that seemed to hang heavy in the atmosphere, each step forward more uncertain than the last. The scent of burning flesh mixed with the acrid smoke of burning wood and metal. Survivors would later speak of how they could taste the ash in the air, how it clung to their tongues and coated their throat. Even the most basic sense-breathing became an arduous task. There was no escaping the oppressive heat or the fumes that seemed to follow you no matter where you went. The city's air was poisoned, and the lungs of those who survived the initial blast were left struggling for breath. The human body, too, felt the weight of the heat, as burns ravaged survivors. Skin charred black and raw, fell off in layers, leaving the survivors physically and mentally scarred. Those who managed to escape with their lives felt the savage toll on their bodies as they stumbled through the wreckage, their feet scorched by the melting pavement beneath them. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not simply confronted with the physical devastation. They also had to grapple with a far more insidious and long-lasting trauma: the emotional toll. In the days that followed, survivors began to walk through the rubble, trying to make sense of the enormity of what had happened. There were no familiar landmarks to guide them. Nothing was left intact. What had once been a thriving, bustling city was now an incomprehensible wasteland, and in this vast emptiness, many survivors felt themselves cut off from the world they had once known. The grief was instantaneous. Many survivors wandered through the ruins, unable to comprehend the loss, the destruction, the deaths of friends and family. The overwhelming shock created a kind of emotional numbness, a state of being that temporarily shielded them from the depths of their grief. It was as if their minds couldn't fully absorb what had just happened. In the chaos and screams, there was no time for mourning. It was as if everyone had to survive first, only to grieve later when the weight of loss finally set in. For many, survivors' guilt became a constant companion. Why had they survived when others had not? Survivors walked through the ashes, constantly confronted by the faces of the fallen. Their memories forever burned into the survivors' minds. It wasn't just loss they had to reckon with, it was the questioning of their own existence. Was it worth surviving? Was there any reason to continue in a world so profoundly shattered? In the years following the bombings, survivors began to deal with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The memories of the explosion, the heat, the burning of their homes, and the screams of their loved ones lingered long after the initial recovery. Survivors found themselves haunted by flashbacks, nightmares, and a pervasive sense of helplessness. Even as they attempted to rebuild their lives, the trauma of the event was a shadow they could not escape. Beyond the immediate psychological effects, survivors also had to contend with the long-term health consequences of radiation exposure. Many would later develop cancer, suffer from radiation sickness, or face chronic illnesses that were the direct result of their exposure to the bomb's radiation. The physical suffering was intertwined with the psychological, creating a cycle of pain that felt endless. For the survivors, the healing process was long and painful. The world around them was never quite the same. Their cities were rebuilt, but the scars, both emotional and physical. The legacy of the atomic bomb didn't end with the physical destruction. It carried forward into the generations that followed, affecting families, children, and grandchildren. The impact was felt in the everyday lives of the Hiroshima, who had to live not just with the trauma of their experience, but also with the societal stigma that came with being a survivor of the atomic bomb. Their stories, though eventually told and shared with the world, became a living testament to the cost of war, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the irreversible damage inflicted on the human spirit. The emotional scars left by the bombings were not something that could be easily healed or even fully understood. They were a haunting reminder of the devastation that war brings, not just to cities and countries, but to the very souls of its people. This in-depth exploration into the psychological impact of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima, Nagasaki paints a vivid picture of the immense emotional toll on survivors. Beyond just physical destruction, this segment focuses on the numbing shock, the long-term trauma, and the unbearable weight of grief survivors carried with them. Through sensory descriptions and a focus on emotional depth, this expansion makes the human experience of the atomic bombings more personal, offering a fuller, more nuanced perspective on the lasting psychological scars left behind. This deepens the understanding of how trauma reverberates long after the event itself has passed, giving the audience a powerful insight into the survivors' resilience and suffering in the aftermath. In the immediate aftermath of the bombings, as survivors stumbled through the ruins, their eyes constantly searching not just for physical refuge, but for any trace of the lives they once knew, it became clear that their world had been irrevocably shattered. There was no clear place to find solace in the devastation, only the jagged remnants of what had once been home, a familiar routine, a life filled with the promise of tomorrow. The search for the lost began almost immediately. Many survivors walked through the streets, unsure of where to go, but instinctively moving toward the remnants of their neighborhoods, their homes, and the places that had once been familiar. Children, parents, siblings, lovers, all now lost in an instant. What they searched for was not just physical, it was memory, fragments of the past, small pieces of things that might still hold some sense of their former lives. Photographs burned beyond recognition, clothing scorched and torn, the worn books that had once held a child's dreams now reduced to ash. Survivors sifted through the ruins, unable to find the smiling faces or comforting voices they had once known. And then, tragically, many survivors found that their search was futile. There were no bodies to mourn, only the empty spaces where families and communities had once existed. What was lost wasn't just material things, it was the essence of what made a person's life whole. It was connections, history, and a sense of belonging. The emotional depth of this loss was something far more profound than anything the survivors could articulate. Memories were all that remained, and even those began to fade amidst the overwhelming physical destruction. In this shattered landscape, the loss wasn't just individual, it was collective. Entire neighborhoods were lost, wiped off the map in a matter of seconds. Survivors weren't just grieving the loss of their own families, but the destruction of an entire community. Collaboration and support that had once made Hiroshima and Nagasaki the living, breathing centers of daily life. Survivors described walking through the ruins and encountering echoes of memories: empty houses, abandoned markets, and half-destroyed schools where their children had once learned. Each destroyed building held the potential for countless untold stories, friendships, and families lost. It was as if the collective memory of a community was erased in an instant. Where once there had been shared laughter, conversations, and celebrations, now only silence remained. For many, the deepest grief came not from the loss of life itself, but from the dissolution of shared experience. In a city that had been so tightly knit, the loss of neighborhoods, of gathering spaces, was felt as a personal assault on a life well. It wasn't just about the death of individuals, it was the end of a way of life that could never be restored. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, children were the most vulnerable, not just in the immediate impact of the bomb, but in the years to come. Entire generations were decimated by the blast, and those who survived were left to navigate a world that had been irrevocably altered, where their futures were clouded with uncertainty. Many children lost not only their parents but their sense of security, their hope for the future, and even their understanding of family. The grief for these children was not just about the death of their loved ones, it was the disappearance of an identity. For the younger survivors, the memories of the bombings became part of their personal narrative. They grew up with the trauma of having lost their family in one instant, watching as their parents struggled to come to terms with their own grief, sometimes unable to provide the emotional stability that children so desperately needed. One of the cruelest ironies of this experience was that many children were forced to grow up in a world of survivors, a world where the dead could never be mourned properly, and their absence was felt as an unspoken absence, a presence that never was, a memory never fully formed. These children grew up not just in a world of loss, but in a world of unanswered questions, where the stories of their parents were left untold. Lost in the chaos of the bomb's aftermath, the trauma of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rippled through generations. As parents who had survived were now faced with the challenge of raising children in the shadow of their own grief. How could they protect their children from the world's cruelest truths, when they themselves had never had the chance to truly heal, unseen and unheard? The silent struggles of the survivors. For many survivors, the most profound loss was not just the loss of family, but the loss of a future. Hopes and desires were wiped away without warning. The question of what comes next was something that many survivors struggled with long after the immediate aftermath had passed. It wasn't just about rebuilding homes and cities, it was about trying to rebuild lives that had been torn apart in the blink of an eye. Yet, despite the overwhelming physical and emotional toll, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki found ways to continue on, even when they were unsure of how. The strength to carry on came from somewhere deep within a quiet, stubborn resilience that refused to let them succumb entirely to despair. But even as they rebuilt, a new disquiet lingered beneath the surface. Every step they took forward was always haunted by the loss they could never fully comprehend or articulate. Many survivors faced immense psychological challenges living with trauma that they couldn't speak of, not because they didn't want to, but because there were no words to describe what they had seen and endured. The loss of life and the end of community were experiences so profound that they could not simply be processed or forgotten. For many survivors, the grief of what was lost both in terms of life and identity would stay with them forever. A world reborn from the ashes. The long road to healing. As the survivors picked through the wreckage, they were forced not just to rebuild the physical structure of their cities, but to rebuild their identities. The intensity of loss often left survivors wondering, who am I now? The person they had been before the bomb no longer existed. They were walking ghosts, not just carrying their own grief, but the grief of an entire generation that had been lost in an instant. In the years following the bombings, survivors began to create new communities, rebuild their homes, and try to reclaim some semblance of their past lives. But the process was never easy. It was never complete. The emotional scars that Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors carried with them were too deep to ever fully heal. And even as their bodies recovered from the physical trauma, the emotional burden remained. The resilience of the survivors, however, was extraordinary. Despite the immense weight of grief, survivors chose to live, to move forward, and to find new meaning in a world that had been irrevocably altered. They raised families, built careers, and sought ways to ensure that the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not be forgotten, sharing their experiences with future generations. Their resilience was a testament not just to the survival of the human spirit, but to the possibility of healing in the face of overwhelming loss. But the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not just a story of recovery. It is a story of loss of the lives and communities that were never fully returned. For the survivors, the long shadow of the atomic bomb would always loom large, and no matter how far they journeyed from that moment in time, they would always carry the weight of what they had lost. This expanded analysis goes deeper into the psychological impact and emotional toll of surviving the atomic bomb. Through sensory-rich descriptions and personal stories, the segment delves into the trauma and loss that went beyond physical destruction. It connects the reader to the profound grief and resilience of the survivors, making the emotional cost of the bombings clear both in the immediate aftermath and in the long-term psychological scars. By focusing on individual stories and the ripple effects of loss, this analysis brings a deeper, more human perspective to the devastation, while maintaining the soothing, calming tone of the narrative. The immediate aftermath of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki left the cities unrecognizable, transforming vibrant communities into apocalyptic landscapes. Hiroshima, a city once alive with a hum of commerce and daily life, now lay in ruins, its streets filled with the wretched scent of burning flesh and charred wood. The smell was overpowering, thick, nauseating mixture of incinerated matter and the remnants of life. Ashes floated in the air, carried on the hot, dry winds, sticking to the faces of survivors, their clothes covered in a fine layer of the city's destruction. The air was thick with acrid smoke, like an enormous bonfire that would not die, suffocating the very breath of those who were left behind. The sounds of devastation were at once deafening and eerily silent. Initially, the explosive force of the bomb was followed by a deafening roar, as though the sky itself had split open. The air was filled with the crash of buildings collapsing, the screams of those who had been caught in the blast, and the crackling of fires consuming everything in their path. As the chaos subsided, a new, more sinister sound took over. The sound of the wounded. Moans and cries echoed through the streets, rising up from beneath the rubble. Those who had survived were left to stagger through the debris, their bodies burned and scarred, with the weight of the world pressing down upon them. Some wounded survivors could not even find the strength to cry out. They moved through the ruins silently, dragging themselves along with the instinct to find safety, or, at the very least, a semblance of it. As survivors moved through the wreckage, there was also the occasional sound of rubble shifting, as if the city itself was still rearranging, settling into its new form. With every step, the ground beneath them felt like a living thing, shifting unpredictably as they tried to find their footing. The crunching of glass, the grinding of metal, and the groaning of what remained were unsettling, a stark reminder that everything they knew was in pieces. But it wasn't just the sound or the sight, it was the heat. Heat waves radiated off the ground, rising and distorting ripples that seemed to twist the very air. Survivors' feet burned as they stepped on the scorched asphalt that had melted under the intense heat of the blast. Each step was a painful reminder that the world beneath them was no longer solid and safe. It was a dangerous terrain filled with the remnants of destruction. The sun felt hot and suffocating, as though it were pressing down upon the survivors, adding a heavy layer of oppression to their already exhausted bodies. The air itself seemed to have turned into something thick and oppressive, pushing down on the chest, making each breath feel like a struggle. It wasn't just the blast that caused the pain, but the searing heat that clung to everything: the ground, the air, the survivors themselves. The heat was like a constant presence, a feeling that nothing in this new world would ever cool down or return to normal. As survivors moved through the debris, they felt the sensation of their bodies burning. Their clothes, once soft and familiar, were now singed and torn, and their skin, still alive, was now a canvas of painful blisters, raw and exposed to the elements. As survivors walked through the destruction, the initial shock and disbelief made everything feel like a dream, a nightmare, perhaps, but one so surreal that it was hard to process. It was numbing, an emotional shock that rendered them almost mechanical. Survivors didn't always know where to go, or even what to do next. They wandered aimlessly, still in shock, unsure of how to react to the new world that lay before them. It was as though their minds were still trying to catch up with what their eyes had seen and what their bodies had endured. There were moments of stunned silence, where survivors couldn't even speak. Speechless, they could only move through the wreckage, unsure of where to turn. Some survivors, paralyzed by the shock, stood still, staring at the destruction around them, unable to understand the scope of what had just happened. The numbness they felt wasn't just a defense mechanism. It was a way to survive in a world that no longer made sense. Some survivors moved through the ruins in a kind of daze, with their actions almost automatic, their minds unable to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. The first few hours were spent simply surviving, trying to navigate through the rubble and smoke, searching for shelter or even just the ability to breathe. There was a strange, almost mechanical calmness in their movements, as though the body, forced to survive, had taken over, while the mind struggled to keep up. At the same time, some survivors felt an almost bizarre sense of peace, the kind that only exists when something so catastrophic happens that the brain can't comprehend it in the moment. They wandered in a detached state, not yet processing the emotional toll. For them, the world had stopped moving in the ordinary way. It was as though their lives had been paused, and they were now living in a space where everything felt unreal, a bizarre limbo that prevented them from truly understanding their loss. For many, the first instinct after the blast wasn't to escape or to save themselves, it was to find family members, to search through the chaos for loved ones. But the world they stepped into wasn't one that could be navigated in the typical ways. Survivors instinctively called out for their loved ones, children, parents, siblings, but the calls went unanswered. It was as though the voices of the city had been swallowed by the explosion itself. In those first moments, the survivors still held on to a silent hope, believing that perhaps their families had been blessed with some form of luck, that they had escaped the wrath of the bomb. But as they moved through the rubble, the reality of the situation began to set in. The fragments of lives that once seemed so solid were now gone, scattered across the city, melted by the blast, or burned beyond recognition. For many survivors, the hope of finding their loved ones faded, replaced by the stark realization that no one had escaped unscathed. In the days that followed, this search became not just a physical act, but an emotional one, a final reckoning with the magnitude of the loss. Survivors slowly accepted the loss of their families, feeling the weight of grief and despair. For some, this would be the hardest part of recovery, coming to terms with the fact that everything they once knew was no longer available to them. The first moments after the atomic bomb hit were marked by a combination of intense sensory overload and a deep psychological numbness. Survivors didn't just struggle with the physical wreckage around them, they also faced a deeper, more profound emotional void. The loss of family, the shattering of communities, and the overwhelming feeling of being trapped in an unfamiliar, chaotic world left survivors struggling to process the magnitude of their experience. This expanded analysis brings to life the numbing shock survivors felt and the intense emotional weight of the initial aftermath. The survivors' search for loved ones, their detached sense of calm, and their gradual realization that their lives would never be the same again make this segment more immersive, engaging, and emotionally resonant. This segment has now delved into the immediate human response to one of history's most catastrophic events. The devastation that came with the atomic bomb was not just a physical cataclysm, it was an emotional earthquake, shaking the very foundations of human lives. Survivors were not merely left with broken buildings and ruined cities. They were left with shattered families, lost loved ones, and memories that could never be restored. In the aftermath, the grief for lost families was overwhelming. The loss of a spouse, child, parent, or sibling was an incomprehensible trauma. Imagine the pain of a husband rushing through the wreckage of the city, calling out for his wife, only to find himself surrounded by nothing but ash and ruin. In his hand, he might hold a charred photograph, the only thing left of the life he had known. The image of his wife, once vibrant and full of life, now barely recognizable, burned beyond recognition. What happens when the people you love are ripped away without warning, and in their place, you are left with a heavy weight of survival? Survivors were forced to come to terms with an immediate and profound sense of displacement, not just physically, but emotionally. They became isolated from the very connections that had once defined their existence. Gone were the daily routines, the comforting presence of family members, the shared meals, the laughter. All that remained was the vacuum of loss, filled only with painful memories. For many, the weight of survivors' guilt was almost unbearable. Why had they survived when everyone they loved had not? This question gnawed at them constantly. Every time they tried to move forward, to rebuild, the question followed them like a shadow. What right do I have to go on when my loved ones didn't? This deep internal conflict exacerbated the trauma. Survivors could no longer just mourn their dead, they had to contend with the psychological burden of their survival itself. Even when survivors found fragments of their families, perhaps the body of a child, or the remains of a spouse, they were left with the heart-wrenching realization that they would never again be able to share a life with those they had loved so deeply. This process of grieving was compounded by the brutality of the situation. There was no time for ritual mourning, no space to grieve properly. Survivors didn't have the luxury of burying their dead in peace, of holding funerals or saying proper goodbyes. There was only chaos, and the compounding loss of everything they had once known. Beyond individual families, the sense of community was also devastated. In cities where generations had grown up together, built lives, and shared experiences, the bomb erased this intricate web of interpersonal connection in an instant. Imagine yourself walking through once bustling streets, places where you once recognized the faces of neighbors, where you could stop for a moment to chat, where familiar voices once greeted you. All of that was gone. The voices that had once made the world feel like home were now silenced. In its place was an overwhelming void, a blank landscape where even the familiar terrain was gone, replaced by rubble and the remains of buildings that had once stood proud. The survivors were left not only with grief for their families, but with a deep sense of loss for the communities that had once been their emotional anchors. There were no longer any neighbors to turn to, no longer any shared spaces where people could come together to talk, cry, or support one another. Even the simple comforts of community gathering for festivals, ceremonies, or even just spending time together were gone. The loss of community identity was one of the most insidious effects of the atomic bomb. For many survivors, this was more than just the displacement from their homes. It was the disintegration of their social networks. People who had once known each other intimately, who had worked side by side, celebrated holidays together, or even been neighbors for decades now, had to rebuild not just their homes, but their sense of belonging in a broken world. The most painful part of this was that many survivors did not have the chance to properly mourn their communities. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, with no remains left for the survivors to even try to hold on to. The trauma of separating from one's community was immense. Social ties, once taken for granted, now felt fragile and tenuous, if not entirely broken. Survivors had to create new connections in a world that felt like a strange and foreign place, without the emotional comfort of the familiar faces and customs they had grown up with. The loss of family and community was also, for many survivors, a loss of self, a complete rupture in their sense of identity. Before the bomb, they had been people with families, jobs, roles within society. After the bomb, their lives were reduced to ashes, and they were left to reconstruct themselves from nothing. The psychological toll of this was profound. Survivors didn't just lose their loved ones, they lost their pasts, their memories of what life had once been. Everything they had once known, every identity they had once possessed, was now buried beneath the ruins of the city. Who am I now, in a world where everything I have known has burned away? What does it mean to be a survivor when nothing feels familiar anymore? For many survivors, their identity was no longer tied to a place, a family, or a community. They were shadows of themselves, walking through a landscape where their old identities no longer fit. To rebuild was to create a new identity, one that could survive in a world that had been transformed forever. The question of who am I was a haunting, existential one, and it haunted every survivor. How could they move forward when everything familiar had been lost? There was a kind of grief that came with the loss of memory, a sense that the past had been erased, and with it, everything that made sense in the world. Memories of family gatherings, neighborhood festivals, shared meals, all of it now felt distant and unattainable. The loss was not just of people, but of context, a context that had given meaning to their lives. In a world where the past had been obliterated, how could survivors find their way forward? The reconstruction of identity was a slow, painful process. Survivors had to reimagine their roles, who they were as individuals and as members of a society in a world that no longer seemed to fit. They began the long and difficult task of shaping new lives for themselves, but always with the shadow of the past hanging over them. It was a journey marked by invisibility, as survivors often felt like they were ghosts in a world that had gone on without them. The legacy of the atomic bomb, far from being confined to the initial blast, continued to cast a long, dark shadow over the survivors 4 years after the event. Unlike the immediate devastation, radiation exposure is a silent, invisible threat, an unseen and insidious age that crept into the bodies of those who lived through the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the survivors, there were no signs, no immediate warning. Radiation, like a ghost in their bodies, seeped in unnoticed. In a way, the radiation felt more unnerving than the explosion itself. The blast was loud and sudden, but radiation entered their bodies gradually, its effects becoming more apparent only much later, often when it was too late. Imagine walking through life in those early days after the bomb, not knowing that your body had been irreversibly altered, that the cells you relied on for survival were now being systematically destroyed. Radiation poisoning was a unique phenomenon. Unlike burns, fractures, or shrapnel injuries that could be immediately treated, or at least understood, a survivor might feel perfectly fine one day, then suddenly become weak and sick the next. You could feel the warmth of the sun or the coolness of the breeze, but you couldn't feel the radiation entering your system, altering your genetic material, and weakening your immune system. For those who were exposed, the first signs of radiation sickness were often inexplicable. They felt the weight of exhaustion and a strange kind of nausea. As more survivors began to show symptoms, it became apparent that something far more deadly was unfolding than anyone had anticipated, and yet, the full extent of the damage, the long-term health consequences, would not be known for many years. The terrifying aspect of radiation wasn't just that it could kill, but that it often did so silently, over time. Survivors found themselves in a state of uncertainty and fear, not knowing what the future might hold for them, or if the unseen damage done to their bodies would eventually catch up with them. In the days and weeks following the explosion, the early signs of radiation sickness began to appear subtle at first, but growing in intensity as the weeks passed. The most immediate of these signs was unrelenting fatigue. The survivors, already physically and emotionally drained from the initial shock of the blast, found themselves overwhelmed by a deep, all-consuming tiredness. Fatigue in this case wasn't the kind that could be fixed with rest. It was a deep and persistent exhaustion, a tiredness that seemed to invade every fiber of their being, leaving them unable to summon the energy to even care for themselves. But fatigue was only the beginning. As the days wore on, the survivors began to experience the more specific effects of radiation sickness. The nausea was relentless waves of sickness that came without warning, as though their bodies were rejecting everything they tried to ingest. Vomiting became a daily experience, and it wasn't just the result of shock or dehydration. It was the direct effect of radiation entering their systems, attacking their digestive systems, making it difficult to keep food or water down. This left them even more weakened and vulnerable, unable to rebuild their strength as their bodies were attacked from the inside out. The nausea was accompanied by other symptoms: headaches, sensitivity to light, dizziness, and painful ulcers that appeared on the survivors' skin and mucous membranes. It was as though their bodies were trying to fight off a foreign invader, but in doing so, they were also destroying themselves. Hair began to fall out in clumps, another glaring sign of the body's fragile state. It wasn't just the discomfort of losing hair, but the painful reminder that their bodies were deteriorating in ways they could neither control nor understand. While the physical signs of radiation sickness were frightening, the invisible scars it left behind were far more devastating. Unlike external wounds that could be tended to and healed over time, the radiation's long-term effects were far less predictable. For some, the first few weeks might have brought relief as they seemed to recover from the acute symptoms, only for the disease to return months or even years later in the form of cancer, particularly leukemia or lung cancer. In those early days, there was no understanding of how radiation affected the body. Survivors walked the streets of their cities, injured, frightened, but unaware of the invisible force within them that was already working its destruction. Those who were lucky enough to survive the initial radiation sickness found that they weren't necessarily out of danger. Radiation didn't stop, didn't leave them in peace, kept working under the surface, altering their cells, changing their DNA, and creating mutations that would manifest years down the line. The terror of radiation was that it didn't reveal itself immediately, and by the time it did, it was often too late. Many survivors lived in fear of the delayed onset of diseases, knowing that they could have been exposed to doses of radiation that were never fully understood. Could the damage take years to show itself? What was once a mild fever or headache could now become a serious, life-threatening condition, as radiation silently weakened the survivors' immune systems. Even more chilling was the uncertainty. No one knew exactly how much radiation each individual had absorbed. Could someone have walked away from the explosion seemingly unscathed only to later fall ill? The lack of clarity created a psychological burden that lasted for decades. It wasn't just the fear of dying from radiation-induced illness, but the constant dread that it could strike at any time, with no warning. The survivors were also left grappling with the psychological trauma of knowing that their bodies had been marked by the bomb. Their bodies weren't just physically scarred, they were changed at the most fundamental level. For some, the psychological burden of surviving the blast, only to succumb later to the long-term effects of radiation, was almost unbearable. The survivors weren't just living with the effects of the bomb, they were living with the knowledge that it could strike again, at any time, from within themselves. The psychological effects of radiation exposure went beyond just the physical illness it caused. Survivors were forced to live with a paranoia that their bodies were ticking time bombs, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. As they watched friends and family members develop illnesses, some survivors began to doubt their own futures, wondering whether their illness was inevitable, a consequence of their proximity to the bomb. The psychological toll also affected communities as a whole. As survivors came together to share their experiences, they often found themselves caught in a web of uncertainty and fear. Who could they trust? Could they rely on medical authorities to explain what had happened? The lack of concrete answers only deepened the emotional and psychological trauma survivors faced. Survivors were left to fend for themselves, navigating the delicate balance between hope and despair as they lived under the threat of radiation poisoning that could come back to haunt them at any moment. The long-term effects of radiation exposure are one of the most devastating legacies of the atomic bomb. In the wake of the explosion, survivors faced not only the physical destruction of their homes and communities, but the silent assault on their body. The immediate sickness of nausea, vomiting, and fatigue was just the beginning. The long-term effects of cancer, immune system breakdowns, and psychological scars continued to devastate survivors long after the bombs had fallen. But it wasn't just the physical suffering that plagued survivors, it was the psychological burden of not knowing when the effects would show up or who would be next. Radiation was a silent enemy that changed the course of their lives, leaving them to live in a world where their bodies were forever altered. The weight of uncertainty about their future health would haunt many survivors for the rest of their lives, making the struggle for survival an ongoing battle not just against the bomb's immediate effects, but against a silent, invisible threat that could strike at any time. The physical rebuilding of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bombings was, at its core, an act of reclamation effort to bring back the cities from the brink of total destruction and restore some semblance of normality. But it wasn't an easy task. The cities had been reduced to ashes. What had once been vibrant neighborhoods, bustling marketplaces, and peaceful streets were now nothing more than charred rubble and burnt ruins. The task ahead was monumental, and the spirit of the survivors was tested not just by the emotional trauma, but by the sheer magnitude of the work needed to rebuild. The physical rebuilding process began almost immediately after the bombings, but the challenges were immense. In the months following the explosions, people began to clear the wreckage, but basic materials like bricks, wood, and steel were in short supply. The infrastructure, roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, had been completely destroyed. Many buildings had collapsed, and even the city's vital systems, water, sewage, electricity, had been obliterated. These were cities without any foundations left. Yet, somehow, life slowly started to return. At first, survivors had to rely on makeshift shelters, with many living in temporary homes, built from scrap materials. The first structures to go up were rudimentary and often lacked basic amenities. Homes were rebuilt in areas that were once vibrant with life, but the scarcity of resources and the overwhelming need for labor meant that the progress was slow. Rebuilding homes was, in many ways, an emotional act of healing. The familiar structures were coming back, but they were empty shells that couldn't restore the past. Still, there was a palpable sense of determination as people cleared the debris, brick by brick, as though putting the pieces of their lives back together. But the physical restoration of these cities was only the surface work. Beneath it lay the deeper, more challenging task of restoring the spirit of the people, the sense of normalcy, community, and hope that had once existed before the bomb. Rebuilding these cities, while necessary, could never fill the emotional void left by the devastation. It was the cities themselves, the once thriving spaces where people lived and worked, that had been lost. And while physical structures were being rebuilt, the emotional connections people had with these spaces were gone. In this way, reconstruction wasn't just about bricks and mortar, but about reclaiming a sense of belonging and identity that had been shattered in an instant. As the cities began to rise from the ashes, the psychological burden of the survivors was becoming more apparent. Surviving the bomb was one thing, but healing from the trauma was another. The emotional toll was deep and often invisible, but survivors carried it in their hearts and minds as they went about the process of rebuilding their lives. The mental reconstruction was far more complex and challenging, with no clear path to healing. In the years after the bombings, survivors faced the painful task of coming to terms with what had happened. The act of rebuilding wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Survivors had to forgive themselves for their survival. This may sound simple, but in a society where the idea of sacrifice and family was so deeply embedded in culture, surviving while their loved ones perished was not something that could easily be reconciled. The trauma of survival was especially difficult for those who had lost entire families. How could they go on when everyone they loved had been taken from them? In many ways, the survivors found themselves at a crossroads. Do they continue living in the face of such overwhelming loss, or do they lose themselves in the memory of what once was? Many survivors struggled with anxiety, depression, and numbness, unable to express the depth of their grief. Because the scars they carried were not just physical but deeply psychological. Their inner worlds were as devastated as the cities they were rebuilding. Yet, despite this profound loss, they also carried a flicker of hope, a determination to live, to reconnect with others, and to honor the memories of the people they had lost. In the years following the bombings, survivors began to gather in small informal groups, exchanging stories and memories. They shared their pain, but also found moments of connection, seeking comfort in knowing they were not alone in their suffering. The act of telling stories, sharing what they had lost and how they had lived through the horrors, became a way to process their trauma, even if it didn't provide an immediate cure. Memory became both a burden and a lifeline, something that had to be held on to, even as it threatened to overwhelm them. Among the most profound and damaging emotional struggles survivors faced was the burden of survivor's guilt. This feeling, so deeply rooted in the experience of loss, was something survivors had to grapple with constantly. Why did I survive when so many others perished? This question was like an echo, repeating itself over and over in the minds of the survivors, especially for those who had lost their entire families or witnessed the death of friends and loved ones. For many, survivors' guilt was so overwhelming that it became a defining part of their lives. They would often find themselves questioning the purpose of their survival. Was I supposed to live when everyone else around me died? The weight of this question never truly lifted, and for many survivors, it became a quiet, invisible companion to their grief. There was a sense of shame that accompanied their survival, as if they had been chosen for something they couldn't understand or explain. They were survivors, but they weren't sure what they had survived for. The survivors struggled with the thought that they had somehow failed those they had loved. If they had been there, if they had done more, would their loved ones still be alive? Many survivors couldn't escape the thought that their own actions or inactions had played a role in the loss. For those who were young, particularly children, Surviving meant not just witnessing the deaths of parents and siblings, but having to live with the unanswered questions about the choices made by others. How could anyone live through such a horrific event without questioning the fairness of it all? The emotional scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't end with the survivors. These wounds passed on to the next generation, and the children of survivors found themselves inheriting the trauma without fully understanding its origins. For many children, growing up with parents who had survived the bombings meant growing up in the shadow of an unspeakable grief. These children, while not directly affected by the bomb itself, inherited the emotional weight carried by their parents. They often grew up surrounded by parents who were silent about the trauma they had endured, unable to express or share the depths of their suffering. The absence of conversation about the events of August 6, 1945, made it difficult for the next generation to understand the full depth of the trauma. Many children grew up with a sense of loss that they could never fully articulate. It wasn't just the absence of their grandparents or uncles and aunts, it was the absence of understanding. They lived in homes where memories were too painful to discuss, and their parents carried around unresolved grief, struggling to find ways to raise their children without passing on the emotional burden of the past. Even as survivors sought to rebuild and reconnect with their pasts, they carried within them the knowledge that their children, too, would carry something intangible, a quiet mourning that was not their own. The trauma of the bombings wasn't just something that affected the immediate survivor. It rippled through families, through generations, changing the very fabric of what it meant to move forward after such a devastating tragedy. For the children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bomb was a ghost they could never escape, an unspoken legacy passed down through generations. The trauma wasn't just something that could be rebuilt with physical structures or monuments. It was an emotional inheritance, one that would take decades to process, and still, it would remain largely invisible. The echoes of the bomb reverberated not just through the bodies of the survivors, but through their children, their grandchildren, and beyond. In the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors' memories became the cornerstone of history, ensuring that the catastrophic events of August 1945 were not erased, but understood deeply and with profound humanity. For the survivors, the act of speaking out, of sharing their stories with the world, became both an emotional catharsis and a moral responsibility. In a world where the atomic bomb had caused such devastation, telling their stories was a way to reclaim the truth of what happened and ensure that it was not forgotten, buried beneath political discourse or historical revisionism. These testimonies weren't just about recounting the destruction. The survivors spoke of what it meant to lose everything, to watch their loved ones vanish in the blink of an eye, and to have their world turned into a landscape of annihilation. Through their words, they breathed life into the ashes, reminding the world of the human cost of war. Mothers, children, and neighbors who were swallowed by the blast. In the years that followed, survivors began to speak sometimes to each other, sometimes to the world of their pain, their survival, and the lessons they hoped to pass on. This act of speaking became a form of preservation, a way of keeping the memories of the lost alive. Each testimony became a living monument, not made of stone, but of words, flowing from the survivors as they shared their anguish, their resilience, and the heavy burden of survival. Their voices carried the weight of human sacrifice, but also the hope that this pain would not be repeated by future generations. As they shared their experiences, survivors were shaping the future through the very act of bearing witness. They knew that their stories would not only serve as a reminder, but also as a lesson. Their survival stories, told across the world, taught the world a deeper truth, that humanity must never again allow such destruction. Their words were not just personal accounts, but a plea for global understanding, peace, and the prevention of future atrocities. Out of the overwhelming grief and loss, a powerful movement for peace and nuclear disarmament emerged, and the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were at its heart. The bombs had claimed their families, their homes, their health, but in the wreckage, they found a reason to fight for something greater than their personal suffering, the survival of humanity. For them, the legacy of peace was not just an ideal, but a moral imperative born out of survival. In the wake of the devastation, survivors dedicated themselves to ensuring that the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would resonate across the world. Their stories were not just personal memories, they became powerful calls to action, urging governments, institutions, and individuals to commit to peace and work towards a world free of nuclear weapons. This legacy, built on the foundation of their pain, transformed their grief into a cause that would shape international policy for decades. The survivors' commitment to peace materialized in memorials and peace parks, particularly in Hiroshima. These spaces, now considered sacred ground, became symbols not just of loss, but of hope. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, with its haunting atomic bomb dome at the center, stands as both a memorial and a warning. It serves as a solemn reminder of the costs of war and as a unifying space where people from all over the world come to reflect on the tragedy of nuclear warfare and to commit to ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The survivors also dedicated themselves to nuclear ensuring that the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not lost on the world. They took their testimonies to international forums and global peace movements, urging leaders to take action to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. They weren't just sharing their pain. They were using their voices to urge policy change and to inspire global action. One of the most enduring examples of their legacy is the peace declaration read each year in Hiroshima on August 6th, the anniversary of the bombing, delivered by the mayor of Hiroshima. The declaration calls for nuclear abolition and world peace, urging the international community to join together in preventing further nuclear conflict. The survivors' stories are embedded in this declaration, each word carrying the weight of decades of suffering and the hope for a world without nuclear war. The survivors didn't just remember the past, they actively shaped the future through their advocacy for peace. They took the pain of their personal losses and turned it into a global movement, one that reached far beyond the boundaries of Japan. Their personal suffering and sacrifice became the foundation of an international movement for peace, one that spread through global disarmament efforts, peace, education, and nonviolent resistance movements around the world. Through their testimonies, survivors called for the world to remember not just the history of the bombings, but also the need for humanity to work together to prevent such destruction. Their advocacy wasn't just for recognition, it was for action. The survivors sought to change the course of history by raising awareness about the true cost of nuclear weapons. Their actions resonated with people worldwide, activists, political leaders, and ordinary citizens alike. Their movement, born out of personal loss, spread far beyond Japan, and was embraced by people who believed that nuclear disarmament and peace were goals worth fighting for. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only confronted the past, but actively shaped the future by challenging the world to recognize the human cost of war and to choose a path of peaceful coexistence. The legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is one of resilience and hope. Survivors carried the weight of unimaginable suffering, but they used that suffering to speak out, to warn future generations, and to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. Through storytelling, they preserved the memory of those lost, and, through their advocacy, they forged a movement that carried their message of peace and nuclear disarmament across the globe. The memorials and peace parks that dot Hiroshima and Nagasaki serve as constant reminders of the toll that war and nuclear weapons can exact on humanity. These spaces are not just places of reflection, they are spaces of hope, urging the world to commit to peace and to prevent the same suffering from ever happening again. The survivors' legacy is not just in the stories they told, but in the actions they inspired. Their voices, their pain, and their commitment to a world without nuclear weapons will echo for generations to come. The survivors didn't just survive, they fought for a world that honored their losses and rejected the weapons of mass destruction that threatened to take even more lives. Through their legacy of peace, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ensured that their suffering was not in vain, and that the horrors of war will never be forgotten. In the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors were thrust into a world where the unimaginable had become their new reality. The physical destruction was just one aspect of the ordeal they faced. The emotional and psychological toll was just as devastating, but perhaps even harder to confront, because it could not be seen by the outside world. While the ruins of the cities were visible to all, the survivors carried their trauma within, often in silence. To rebuild was more than just to reconstruct buildings or homes, it was to reclaim a sense of identity and purpose after everything they knew had been obliterated in an instant. The first steps toward healing were almost entirely individual. The numbness that followed the blast, that sense of disorientation and shock, took days, weeks, even months to wear off. In this time, many survivors experienced what could only be described as a state of emotional paralysis, unable to fully comprehend the scale of loss they had just endured. And yet, as time passed, they began to rebuild. Not only the physical structures of their cities but their inner world, slowly reimagining their lives in a world that seemed at times impossible to understand. The process of rebuilding identities was a deeply personal and often solitary task. Survivors had to reconcile the image of who they had been before the bomb and the person they had become afterward, a person marked by loss, a person now carrying a silent burden of memory and grief. Many survivors felt lost in the midst of this reconnection, unsure of who they were anymore, in a world where their past had been so violently erased. They often had to confront a profound question. Who am I now? How do I move forward when everything I once knew is gone? In this silent struggle for meaning, the survivors also had to confront the difficult reality of being the living witnesses to a loss that could never be undone. For many, the guilt of surviving while so many others perished was an almost unspeakable burden. Yet, there was also a shared recognition among many survivors that this guilt must be acknowledged not, but something that could be shared through storytelling, through speaking to one another. This shared grief, this collective recognition of the immeasurable weight of survival, helped survivors begin to heal not just for themselves, but for those who were lost. One of the most powerful tools survivors used to navigate this painful process was storytelling. The act of sharing their stories became both a means of preservation and healing. By speaking their truth, survivors were able to make the invisible visible, to give voice to the unspeakable pain they had endured. The stories they shared were not just about personal loss, but about a universal human experience. Their narratives weren't only meant to memorialize the dead, but also to educate and warn future generations. The survivors knew that their stories could help to prevent history from repeating itself. As they began to speak out, the survivors slowly realized the importance of their own role in ensuring the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Telling their stories wasn't just a cathartic release, it was an act of responsibility, a moral obligation to ensure that the horrors of nuclear warfare would never be forgotten. They became the voices of the future, calling on the world to remember what had happened and to prevent any future destruction like it. In the years following the bombings, these survivors became silent teachers. They shared their stories in intimate settings at local gatherings, in private memorials, in formal speeches at peace conferences, slowly building a movement of remembrance. Each person who listened to their accounts became part of a larger network of memory, a vast web that connected those who lived through the bombings with those who had yet to fully understand their significance. Through their voices, they ensured that the world would never forget the cost of nuclear weapons. The survivors' journey of healing was not just about personal recovery, but also about collective responsibility. As they worked to process their trauma, many survivors became the leading voices in the global peace movement. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't just rebuild their lives. They dedicated themselves to ensuring that the horrors they had lived through would never happen again. Through advocacy, memorialization, and their collective testimonies, they called for a world free of nuclear weapons. Survivors were not merely victims of the bomb, they were the living proof of its devastating consequences. Their pain, though deeply personal, became a global message about the need for peace and nuclear In every speech, every conversation, every encounter with the international community, they shared their message: no more suffering, no more nuclear warfare. This became their legacy. The survivors' efforts culminated in the creation of places like the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, a space dedicated not only to the memory of the lives lost, but also to the idea that peace could prevail over war. This park, with its atomic bomb dome still standing, served as a physical manifestation of the survivors' will to remember and educate. The survivors themselves became the living memorial, teaching the world that peace was not just an ideal, but a necessity for the future of humanity. The legacy of the survivors lives on today in global peace movements and nuclear disarmament advocacy. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the campaigns against nuclear testing, and the calls for a world without nuclear weapons were significantly influenced by the survivors' relentless campaigning. They reminded the world that nuclear weapons were not merely political instruments, they were tools of mass destruction, capable of eradicating entire civilizations in an instant. As survivors shared their experiences, they not only created the memorials, they also set in motion a global dialogue about the ethics of war and the future of the planet. Generations later, the echoes of their voices continue to guide policymakers, human rights advocates, and ordinary people in their ongoing quest to reduce nuclear arsenals, educate about the dangers of nuclear proliferation, and advocate for lasting peace. Through their legacy of remembrance, Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors continue to shape the world, as understanding of war as true cost and the irreplaceable value of peace. In conclusion, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not just the last witnesses to the bombings. They are the living lessons of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear warfare. They rebuilt their cities physically, but they also rebuilt their spirits through the power of storytelling and peace advocacy. Their voices, even decades later, carry the weight of history, ensuring that the world never forgets the suffering that was wrought by the atomic bomb. Their collective legacy is a call to action, one that transcends the personal suffering they endured. It is a warning, a plea for peace, and a promise to future generations that the horrors of the past should never be repeated. Through their commitment to peace, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ensured that their stories would continue to inspire the movement for nuclear disarmament and the quest for a more peaceful world. Their legacy of peace will live on for as long as there are people to listen to their stories and act upon them. As the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, they were confronted by an insidious, invisible threat that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. While the immediate physical damage from the bombings was visible and undeniable, the destruction of buildings, the fires that consumed entire neighborhoods, the visible wounds on the bodies of those caught in the blast, the effects of radiation were far more subtle. Radiation didn't cause pain that could be measured immediately. It didn't leave obvious scars or burn marks on the skin, making it difficult for both survivors and medical personnel to understand the gravity of the threat. In a world where everything had changed within seconds, the survivors could feel the intensity of the destruction in their bodies, but could not comprehend its full scope. Radiation seeped into their bodies silently, altering their cells, disrupting their DNA, and causing damage that they couldn't see or feel. Unlike the visible, immediate violence of the blast, radiation was a slow-moving agent of harm that continued its work long after the fires had gone out. The full effects of the exposure wouldn't reveal themselves immediately. Radiation's toll was often more subtle and gradual, showing up weeks, months, or even years later, leaving survivors in the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing the true extent of their exposure. To the survivors, the effects of radiation were deeply alien, an enemy that wasn't even visible to the naked eye. They were given no immediate explanation for the invisible forces that had entered their body. Doctors in the aftermath, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster, could not immediately identify the cause of the symptoms emerging in the survivors. The true danger of radiation would only gradually unfold, leaving a trail of devastation that could not be seen but would affect the survivors' health for decades. In the immediate aftermath of the bombings, the survivors' focus was on survival, finding food, water, and shelter amidst the charred remains of their cities. Their bodies, already traumatized by the physical blast and heat, now had to contend with the unseen dangers of radiation. At first, survivors simply felt tired, exhausted, as if the energy had been drained from their very bones. The initial symptoms, such as nausea, dizziness, and unexplained weakness, were easy to mistake for the result of the bomb's physical effects. But as the days passed, these symptoms began to intensify, leaving survivors with a distinct impression that they were not just recovering from an injury, but were fighting against something far more elusive and destructive. Survivors, who had been exposed to the greatest doses of radiation, began to see their hair fall out in clumps, often with no clear explanation as to why. For many, this loss of hair was not only a physical shock, but also a psychological blow, a clear indication that something was wrong deep within their body. These were the early signs of radiation sickness, but no one could yet understand what they meant for the long-term survival of those affected. The survivors who had once lived full, vibrant lives found themselves suddenly trapped in a cycle of sickness, unsure whether they would recover or succumb to the damage that was silently being done to their bodies. One of the most terrifying aspects of radiation exposure was that the damage it caused was often hidden. It was not something that could be seen immediately, and survivors often didn't know if they had been exposed to a dangerous dose. While the physical wounds and injuries of the bombing were visible to all, radiation's effects were often invisible until it manifested years later as cancer, leukemia, or other debilitating illnesses. The survivors could not escape the constant dread that hung over them. They had already lived through hellish devastation, and now, the very act of surviving seemed to come with the terrifying unknown of future illness. The survivors' fears were compounded by the knowledge that they were living with an invisible enemy that could strike them at any time. The emotional weight of uncertainty became a constant companion. No one knew who would be affected and when, or whether they would develop life-threatening diseases like cancer or leukemia. Survivors who had once dared to hope that they might escape the worst were now confronted by the chilling reality that they could not fully comprehend the true scope of their exposure. Radiation had altered their DNA, and for some, the effects would not be visible for decades. As the years passed, chronic diseases began to surface. Cancers, leukemia, and various internal injuries emerged in the survivors, often without warning. The survivors now had to grapple with the harsh truth that the radiation had forever changed the course of their lives. These illnesses often carried a sense of fatalism. Many didn't know if they were the lucky few who had survived the initial explosion, but would now succumb to the lingering effects of radiation, or if they were living with the silent threat of radiation that could one day claim their life. The unpredictability of the situation caused deep psychological distress. While the immediate aftermath of the bombings was horrific, the long-term impact of radiation exposure was perhaps the most insidious. Medical professionals were slow to understand the full effects of radiation, and many survivors went untreated or were misdiagnosed in the years after the bombing. For some, the wait for proper medical understanding felt like a second sentence, life spent waiting for the inevitable while trying to rebuild from the ashes. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had already endured a trauma unlike anything imaginable, and now they had to live with the ongoing uncertainty of when radiation might finish what the bomb had started. In the years following the bombings, a strange sense of unease and guilt took root among the survivors. Why had I survived when so many others hadn't? Why am I still alive when I might be slowly dying from radiation exposure? These existential questions haunted many survivors. In a way, surviving the initial devastation wasn't the end of their suffering. It was only the beginning of a long, unseen battle that would last the rest of their lives. Survivors were forced to live with the trauma, knowing that they were marked by the radiation in ways that they would never fully understand. The survivors' experiences with radiation were not just personal, they became an integral part of the historical understanding of nuclear weapons. The survivor stories of radiation exposure played a critical role in educating the world about the dangers of nuclear warfare. Survivors' advocacy for nuclear disarmament and peace brought their personal suffering to the forefront, ensuring that their pain and loss would not be forgotten. In the years after the bombings, the survivors' experiences with radiation poisoning became a catalyst for change. Their voices brought attention to the human cost of nuclear warfare, sparking international movements for nuclear disarmament and peace. They demanded that their stories be heard and that future generations understand the true toll of nuclear weapons, not just in terms of immediate death and destruction, but also in the long-term consequences of radiation exposure. As survivors shared their stories, their personal struggles became a symbol of the enduring legacy of the bomb, a reminder that after effects of nuclear warfare extend far beyond the initial devastation and affect future generations in ways that cannot be undone. The legacy of radiation sickness and the ongoing efforts to ensure global peace, one of the most important aspects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's history. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought with them not only the immediate destruction of life and infrastructure but also a silent, pervasive force radiation. This invisible, deadly phenomenon would soon reveal itself as a secondary weapon of mass destruction, one that wasn't felt immediately, but whose effects lingered and grew over time. Survivors of the bombings, still in shock from the devastating blast, unknowingly walked through a world contaminated by a force they could not see, hear, or even comprehend. The dangers of radiation exposure, though it started with immediate trauma, would extend far beyond what anyone could predict. In those first chaotic hours, the survivors' primary concern was simply survival, finding food and water, tending to wounds, and navigating a landscape that had been utterly transformed by the bomb. But what they didn't know was that radiation was already infiltrating their body. It seeped silently into their skin, their lungs, and their bloodstream. There was no obvious warning, no signs that something as intangible as radiation was at work. Yet, this invisible poison would become their invisible tormentor. Radiation exposure was not something the survivors could see or feel in any immediate way. The blast had brought them an immediate shock, the sight of destruction, and the harsh reality of human suffering. But radiation, unlike fire or debris, did not manifest in physical destruction immediately. It was a silent killer, one that affected them on a microscopic level, altering the DNA in their cells, poisoning them in ways that would only reveal themselves after weeks, months, or even years. This delay was what made radiation sickness so terrifying. It to be measured or anticipated, until it had already caused significant damage. Imagine, as a survivor, trying to process the events of that day, your world reduced to rubble, your family gone, your home destroyed. Then, after surviving the immediate disaster, you start feeling unexplainable symptoms. Fatigue, that never seems to go away. Nausea, that comes without warning. and the unexplainable sensation that something inside your body is changing, but you don't know what or why. These early signs, though deceptively mild in comparison to the initial trauma of the bomb, were the markers of a much more devastating force that would unfold in the years to come. Radiation sickness would become the second battle, one that survivors couldn't see, yet would affect them in ways more devastating than anyone could imagine. At first, many survivors simply attributed their strange fatigue to the immense physical toll of the bomb. After all, they had just survived an unprecedented disaster. Their bodies had been through so much already. However, as days passed, the physical exhaustion persisted. Nausea set in for many, along with the debilitating fatigue that didn't subside with rest. For the first time, they began to suspect that their bodies were not simply recovering from the blast, but were reacting to something far more troubling. Vomiting became common. Many survivors felt lightheaded and weak. Their skin, already burned by the intense heat of the explosion, began to show signs of radiation burns, a form of injury that took a long time to heal. But what truly stood out was the sudden and dramatic loss of hair. It was as if a part of their very being, something as fundamental as their appearance, was being taken from them. Hair would fall out in clumps, often in places where there had been no burns or visible signs of injury. For the survivors, this was one of the most visible and disconcerting indicators that something had gone terribly wrong. However, it wasn't just the physical symptoms that were there was a psychological weight to radiation sickness, one that was not immediately visible. As survivors began to realize that the physical symptoms they were experiencing didn't correspond to normal injuries, the fear of radiation began to take root. There was no way to measure how much radiation a person had been exposed to. The survivors had no idea if they had received a lethal dose or whether they would eventually be stricken by more severe symptoms. The uncertainty surrounding radiation exposure became a constant presence in their lives, adding a new layer of stress to an already traumatic existence. Painful physical symptoms were exacerbated by a growing sense of helplessness. The survivors didn't whether they would be among the fortunate ones who would survive without further complications, or whether their health would deteriorate silently and mysteriously over time. This uncertainty was not just a physical burden. It was a psychological weight that continued to haunt them long after the bombs had dropped. While the survivors were dealing with immediate effects of radiation sickness, the true, long-term impact of radiation was still hidden from their awareness. Over time, the acute symptoms of nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and hair loss began to subside. But what they didn't know was that the radiation had altered their bodies at a cellular level, wreaking havoc on their genetic material. The damage done to their cells wasn't something they could feel right away. It was an internal change that would only become noticeable years later when cancer, leukemia, or other radiation-induced diseases began to take their toll. The silent nature of radiation meant that the survivors couldn't see the long-term damage it caused to their internal organs. It took years for leukemia to appear in some survivors, while others developed solid cancers, such as lung or thyroid cancer, years after the bomb. Survivors who had thought they had escaped the worst of the atomic blast now found themselves struggling with illnesses, had no obvious origin illnesses that they had no way of linking back to the bomb. For those who survived the initial trauma of the bomb and its aftermath, this slow burn of radiation sickness was like an ongoing shadow that loomed over their future. The fear of developing these delayed effects made many survivors feel like they were constantly under threat, even long after the physical scars had healed. Many survivors found themselves living with the guilt of their survival, wondering if the cancer or illness they would later develop was a punishment for being the ones who survived. While their families or neighbors had perished, the psychological toll of radiation poisoning extended far beyond the initial trauma of the bomb. For many survivors, the effects of radiation sickness weren't just physical, they were emotional and psychological, too. The uncertainty of not knowing who was most affected by radiation left many survivors feeling like time bombs, waiting for their bodies to betray them at any moment. This created an ongoing sense of stress and fear that didn't dissipate with time. Survivors' guilt also became an ever-present burden. The survivors often questioned their right to live when so many others had died. Why had I survived? It was a question that many would carry for the rest of their lives. As some survivors faced long-term health problems, they wondered if they were being punished for their survival, or if there was some deeper moral implication of being spared, while others were taken. The mental anguish of radiation sickness was not just about the physical symptoms, it was about living in the shadow of uncertainty. Radiation was an invisible force, and the fear of the unknown was as much a part of the trauma as the physical pain. Many survivors became emotionally scarred by the constant anxiety that came with not knowing when the radiation might manifest. This uncertainty made it impossible to heal completely. One of the most insidious aspects of radiation exposure was the delay in its visible effects. While the immediate devastation of the atomic bomb was clear to everyone, obliterated buildings, a city reduced to rubble, and mass casualties, the true damage done by radiation was not immediately apparent. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who had already witnessed and endured unimaginable horror, were now faced with an invisible and relentless adversary. For many, the initial period after the bombings, though difficult and traumatic, was filled with an eerie sense of relief as the immediate symptoms seemed to subside. The acute sickness of vomiting, dizziness, nausea, and hair loss began to fade, and many survivors were left with a feeling of cautious optimism. The initial shock of the blast, the unbearable heat, and the collapsing world around them seemed to give way to a quiet recovery. For those who had survived, there was a glimmer of hope that perhaps they had escaped the worst, that they might find a sense of normalcy again in the midst of the destruction. But the real terror of radiation lay in its invisible nature. Though the survivors felt as if they had bounced back, their bodies were already undergoing alterations at the cellular level. The damage done by radiation wasn't something that could be seen or easily detected by a doctor, a stethoscope, or a simple examination. It was happening deep within, as the radiation's energy disrupted DNA and mutated cells. These hidden scars would go unnoticed for months, even years, while the survivors attempted to rebuild their lives and their homes. In the years that followed the bombings, as survivors tried to resume their lives amidst the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the effects of the radiation began to manifest in disturbing ways. What initially seemed like a recovery was, in fact, the calm before the storm. Survivors who had endured the worst of the physical devastation now found themselves facing the silent, long-term effects of radiation poisoning. Many developed cancers, particularly leukemia, which became one of the most common and visible illnesses among the survivors. Leukemia is a type of cancer that affects the blood and bone marrow, and it was directly linked to the radiation exposure the survivors had experienced. The survivors, who had already dealt with so much, now found themselves caught in an endless cycle of pain, hospital visits, and treatments. They had survived the immediate devastation, only to be confronted by an unseen disease that left them feeling trapped in their own body. Other forms of cancer also began to emerge. Cancers of the thyroid, lungs, and stomach were common, and each diagnosis was a stark reminder that the radiation had done its damage, not only in the moment of exposure, but that it had set in motion a long-term process that would take years to fully unfold. But radiation didn't just cause cancer. Survivors were also plagued by a range of other chronic illnesses that had no clear explanation. Some experienced gastrointestinal problems, such as chronic diarrhea, which weakened their bodies over time. Others struggled with cardiovascular problems, as radiation damaged their hearts and blood vessels. The fear of these illnesses hanging over them was nearly as painful as the diseases themselves, for there was no way to predict who would be affected or when the illness would strike. It was a randomness that turned survival into an ongoing ordeal, where the trauma didn't end with a bombing, but was instead sustained and prolonged for the rest of their lives. While the physical effects of radiation were devastating, the psychological toll was equally profound. Survivors who had already lived through the horrors of the blast were now forced to live with an unseen, enemy radiation sickness which would linger in their bodies without any certainty about when it might fully manifest. This uncertainty was a burden that many survivors carried for decades. For those who survived the bomb, the fight wasn't over once the fires were extinguished and the ruins began to be cleared. Instead, they faced the unrelenting fear of not knowing when the next wave of illness would strike. The emotional weight of this unknown was immense. Survivors often found themselves trapped in a constant cycle of worry and dread, unable to fully move on from their experiences. How could they rebuild their lives when they didn't know whether their bodies were ticking time bombs? Would they develop cancer? Would their children? This constant anxiety left many survivors feeling powerless, like they were living on borrowed time, with no way of knowing how much of it was left. Moreover, the shame and guilt of surviving while others had perished played a significant role in the psychological aftermath. Many survivors of the bombing would ask themselves, "Why did I survive? Why was I spared?" These feelings of survivor-esque guilt were complicated by the fear that they would be punished by the radiation in ways that might seem unfair. They had already suffered so much, but the knowledge that they were now living with radiation's long-term effects added another layer of grief and psychological pain. It wasn't just the physical illnesses that haunted them. It was the emotional weight of living under the constant threat of illness. For the survivors, the physical and emotional trauma of radiation was an ongoing, invisible struggle. Unlike the destruction caused by the bomb's immediate blast, the toll of radiation exposure was something that couldn't be seen or measured right away. It was an invisible war waged deep within their body. And just as there was no immediate relief for the physical pain, there was no immediate healing for the psychological scars. Survivors faced an uncertain future, knowing that their lives were permanently altered not just by the destruction of their homes and families, but by the invisible force that had entered their body, leaving behind a legacy of uncertainty. The trauma of radiation poisoning didn't just impact the survivors themselves. It affected their families, their communities, and even future generations. Many survivors lived with the fear of passing on the effects of radiation to their children or grandchildren. The genetic damage caused by radiation exposure could result in birth defects or genetic mutations that might manifest in subsequent generations, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the original survivors. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after facing the immediate devastation of the atomic bombs, found themselves caught in a silent battle with an invisible and insidious enemy. Unlike the visible wounds caused by the blast, radiation exposure left scars that could not be seen, and the survivors' struggle with these invisible effects became an ongoing and complex journey, often defined by uncertainty, fear, and misunderstanding. The atomic bombings, with their initial and overwhelming impact, brought immediate devastation. Yet the long-term consequences of radiation exposure, its silent effects, would prove to be a different kind of battle. The bombs not only obliterated cities, but also altered the very fabric of the survivors' lives, both physically and emotionally. In the years and decades that followed the explosions, radiation would continue to take a toll on the bodies of those who had survived. And this journey of suffering would unfold in a way that was as mysterious as it was devastating. While the immediate effects of the bombs were felt in the explosion, the true, unseen scars of radiation exposure began to manifest only after the initial trauma had subsided. These effects didn't show up in obvious or immediate ways. Instead, they crept into the bodies of survivors, slowly, over time, like an invisible poison that would remain in the background, unrelenting and unpredictable. This unknown factor of radiation's toll is what would haunt many of the survivors long after the destruction had faded into history. At first, the survivors were preoccupied with the immediate aftermath, the destruction of homes, the loss of loved ones, and the struggle to survive in a now devastated world. For those who survived the bomb, the initial focus was on basic survival, finding food and water, treating physical wounds, and helping those who had been affected by the blast. As days turned into weeks, the survivors began to recover physically, at least on the surface. However, this apparent recovery masked the far-reaching effects of radiation. Radiation is a subtle, slow-moving toxin that invades the body at a cellular level. In the initial aftermath of the bombings, many survivors found themselves feeling fatigued, suffering from nausea, and noticing that their hair began to fall out in clumps. These were the first physical signs that their bodies had been exposed to a lethal force they could neither see nor fully understand. But in the early stages, many survivors attributed these symptoms to the exhaustion and physical toll of surviving such a traumatic event. The truth, however, was much more troubling. Radiation, as an invisible force, works silently inside the body. For those who received a high dose of radiation, the effects began to manifest not immediately but in the form of long-term illnesses that would strike years later. Leukemia, thyroid cancer, lung cancer, and other cancers became prevalent among the survivors, and many of these illnesses took years to fully develop, creating a sense of ongoing dread for those affected. The fear of developing these diseases was a constant presence, hanging over the survivors like a dark cloud, as they were forced to endure a silent suffering that came years after the bomb's immediate impact. The most difficult aspect of radiation exposure wasn't just the physical damage it caused. It was the psychological toll it had on the survivors. While some survivors felt the immediate effects of the bomb, many faced years of uncertainty about whether or not they had been exposed to a lethal dose of radiation. The survivors lived in a constant state of suspense, unable to know when or if they would begin to experience the effects of radiation sickness. The emotional burden of not knowing when the next shoe would drop was enormous. For those who had already lived through the horrific bombing, this was a continuation of their trauma, fear that was impossible to escape. Radiation exposure became a psychological wound in its own right, causing constant anxiety and fear about one's health. survivors couldn't simply move on from the bombings. The unpredictability of radiation's effects kept many of them in a state of ongoing vulnerability. Would they develop cancer? Would their children inherit any lasting effects? This uncertainty gnawed at the survivors daily, making it impossible to truly heal from the bombings. The fear was compounded by the fact that radiation sickness didn't follow any predictable path. There was no way to tell who would develop leukemia or who might develop cancer years down the line. The randomness of who would be affected, and when, made it impossible for survivors to fully understand their fate. Many survivors spent years wondering whether they would be the next victim, whether the sickness would come for them or their families. Health checks, hospital visits, and constant monitoring became a routine part of their lives, creating a sense of instability and fear that never truly went away. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, radiation's silent and insidious toll created an atmosphere of constant anxiety and vulnerability. The initial effects of the bomb were horrifically visible: destroyed cities, mass casualties, and physical injuries. But radiation sickness introduced a new kind of suffering, one that was not immediately visible but persisted for years in the bodies of the survivors. This invisible threat took a slow, methodical toll on their bodies and minds. They had already survived the initial devastation, but now they had to face the invisible damage that would haunt them for decades. The uncertainty of survival, of never knowing when or if radiation sickness would strike, added a new layer of trauma for the survivors. While some were able to rebuild their lives physically, they could never fully rebuild emotionally. The fear of illness, the mystery of radiation's long-term effects, and the guilt of surviving while others had died, created a psychological burden that was as heavy as the initial blast. Survivors were haunted by the memory of the bomb, yes, but also by the unspoken knowledge that the atomic bomb didn't just destroy lives. It continued to destroy lives in ways that couldn't be seen or understood until years later. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became living archives of the effects of radiation. Their stories, the pain, the uncertainty, and the eventual illnesses they endured provided critical insights into the long-term impacts of nuclear weapons. These personal accounts, and the scientific research that followed, helped shape the modern understanding of the effects of radiation exposure and nuclear warfare. The survivors' experiences became a crucial part of the global conversation about nuclear disarmament and the need to prevent future atrocities like the atomic bombings. As the years passed, the survivors' advocacy for peace became a driving force in the fight against nuclear weapons. Their endurance, their stories, and their legacy ensured that the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not be forgotten, and that future generations would be reminded of the cost of war, not just in terms of immediate death and destruction, but in the long-lasting, unseen consequences of weapons of mass destruction. The legacy of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while defined by the immediate destruction and loss of life, extends far beyond the flash and the ensuing devastation. Radiation exposure, the silent and unseen aftermath of these bombings, has had a profound and enduring effect on the lives of the survivors. This invisible toll, carried through the bodies of the survivors, represents a different kind of suffering, a long-term struggle with an enemy they could neither see nor fully understand. In the initial moments after the bombings, the survivors were thrust into a new world, one where the landscape had been obliterated, and the very air seemed to pulse with the energy of a weapon, whose scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. Yet, even as survivors sifted through the rubble and began the painful process of rebuilding their lives, another danger lingered. Unlike the visible damage caused by the blast, radiation exposure could not be immediately perceived. It was a slow-moving and insidious threat, one that would manifest itself over time, often in ways that were unpredictable and debilitating. In the aftermath of the bombing, many survivors began to show symptoms: nausea, vomiting, fever, and hair loss. For a while, these were understood as signs of the immediate shock to their systems. However, as the days and weeks passed, a deeper, more pervasive toll began to reveal itself. One that would not just affect the survivors physically but emotionally and psychologically as well. The long-term consequences of radiation exposure remained largely unknown in the immediate aftermath, leaving survivors to live with an ever-present uncertainty about their health. The true devastation of radiation exposure is that it doesn't present itself in an obvious, immediate manner. In a typical form of physical injury, there is an outward sign: bruises, burns, but with radiation, the harm is hidden, deeply embedded within the body's tissues, altering DNA, damaging cells, and disrupting the natural function of internal systems. Many survivors, having lived through the explosion, began to feel the early signs of radiation sickness: fatigue, nausea, and hair loss, but those were only the beginning of a much deeper, more insidious toll. In the years that followed, the survivors faced the grim reality that radiation had begun its work in ways they couldn't comprehend. Many began to develop leukemia, a cancer of the blood and bone marrow, which was one of the most common diseases linked to radiation exposure. But there were other cancers as well: thyroid, lung, and stomach cancer, to name a few, all of which would become more prevalent in the decades following the bombings. This slow, almost imperceptible erosion of health was, in many ways, the true scar of the atomic bomb. The unseen enemy left its mark on the body long after the initial blast, and it would take years before the survivors understood just how deeply they had been affected. What was perhaps most harrowing about this was the uncertainty. The survivors, who had already survived the most catastrophic event in modern history, now found themselves facing a second, invisible battle. They didn't know if they had been exposed to lethal doses of radiation, or if they would develop one of the myriad diseases linked to exposure. For many, the fear of radiation sickness became as traumatic as the explosion itself, a constant companion, always lurking just below the surface. While the physical effects of radiation were devastating, the psychological impact was equally profound. Survivors, who had already lived through the horror of the bombings, now faced the mental toll of not knowing when the next wave of sickness would strike. The psychological strain of living with an invisible enemy that could reappear at any moment was immense. For many, the fear of developing cancer or other radiation-related diseases became a constant source of anxiety and uncertainty. Survivors often found themselves caught in a vicious cycle of worry, unable to fully move on from the trauma of the bombings. How could they rebuild their lives when they were uncertain about their own health? Would they suffer from cancer, or would their children inherit the effects of the radiation? This existential fear was compounded by the fact that survivors couldn't even pinpoint who had been most affected. The radiation didn't affect everyone equally, and there was no clear way of knowing who had received the highest dose. Some survivors lived with the nagging doubt that they might be living on borrowed time, uncertain of how many more years they would have before radiation's toll became evident. Moreover, this constant fear was intensified by the social stigma attached to radiation sickness. Many survivors were reluctant to speak openly about their health issues, as they feared being ostracized or treated differently, and because of their exposure to radiation, the stigma surrounding radiation sickness created a psychological isolation that many survivors found difficult to bear. They had already suffered so much, and now they had to live with the added weight of knowing that their health was in jeopardy, often without the support or understanding of others. The effects of radiation exposure did not end with the survivors. In many cases, the trauma and damage inflicted by the bombings were passed down to future generations. The children of survivors, who were exposed to the radiation in the womb or shortly after birth, often faced their own health problems as a result of the genetic mutations caused by radiation. These genetic mutations manifested in a variety of ways: birth defects, developmental issues, and other health complications. This intergenerational trauma added another layer of suffering for the survivors, as they watched their children suffer the effects of a war they had survived. The legacy of the bombings was not just about the physical suffering endured by the survivors, but also about the psychological and emotional toll it took on the next generation. Children of survivors often grew up in a world where their parents' pain was unspoken, a silent legacy that was passed down through shared experiences and the unspoken trauma of growing up in the shadow of a global catastrophe. The long-term psychological effects of the bombings were not just limited to the survivors themselves but extended to their families, creating a cycle of trauma that was difficult to escape. The legacy of radiation exposure remains one of the most devastating and far-reaching effects of the atomic bombings. It was not just the immediate physical destruction that left its mark on the survivors, but the invisible, long-term consequences of radiation that would continue to affect their lives and the lives of their families for decades to come. The psychological toll of living with the unknown, the fear of illness, and the stigma of radiation sickness became a silent battle that many survivors fought every day. Radiation's invisible scars were often more destructive than the physical wounds, because they could not be seen, and they left behind a lingering sense of uncertainty and fear that never truly went away. In the wake of the atomic bombings, Japan found itself in a state of complete destruction, both physically and psychologically. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were decimated, their landscapes marked by ruins and the aftermath of devastation. Beyond the rubble and ruins, however, lay a more insidious task. How could a nation rebuild not only its physical infrastructure, but also its collective identity? How could a society, whose spirit had been shattered, reconstitute itself and move forward into a peaceful future? the task of physical reconstruction was an urgent priority. In the immediate aftermath, survivors and workers faced the formidable challenge of rebuilding homes, businesses, and essential services. Yet this rebuilding effort went beyond just repairing buildings. It required the very reconstruction of society itself. As the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to rise from the ashes, so too did the lives of those who had been affected by the bombings. However, no amount of construction could immediately address the emotional scars left on the people. The psychological and cultural trauma lingered in the air, just as the radiation had lingered in their bodies. For the survivors, recovery was never a simple return to normal. The trauma of the bombings permeated the very fabric of Japanese society, demanding an entirely new understanding of what it meant to live in a world that had witnessed such unparalleled devastation. The bombings had left deep emotional wounds that required far more than just time and reconstructions. They required healing on a national scale. The process of rebuilding Japan's physical infrastructure was a monumental task. Entire neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and government buildings were gone in an instant. The devastation was so complete that the survivors had no choice but to start from scratch. The process of rebuilding these cities was not just about reconstruction, it was about reclaiming the spirit of the people who lived in them. For the survivors, the city represented not just their home, but the essence of their lives. In Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial Park was created in honor of those lost in the bombings. The atomic bomb dome, which miraculously survived the blast, became an enduring symbol of the city's resilience. The park was a place of quiet reflection, where survivors and visitors could gather to reflect on the devastation and the resolve of the Japanese people to rebuild. The reconstruction efforts in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki focused on restoring not just the physical structure of the cities, but the sense of community that had been ripped apart. However, the rebuilding of Japan was not limited to just the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The entire nation faced the daunting task of restoring its economy and political structures. After the surrender, Japan found itself under the occupation of American forces. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the American occupation was tasked with reforming Japan's military, economic, and political systems. The Japanese economy, once largely geared toward military production, now had to transition to civilian production. With much of the country's industrial infrastructure destroyed, Japan's recovery required an international effort, including loans, aid, and the reformulation of the country's industrial base. Yet, despite the massive infrastructure damage and the political transformation under occupation, Japan's recovery over the coming years would become nothing short of remarkable. By the 1960s, Japan would emerge as one of the world's largest economies, an industrial powerhouse, and a symbol of resilience. Psychological reconstruction. The burden of survivors' guilt and collective trauma. While the physical rebuilding of the country was taking place, the psychological reconstruction was much more complicated. For the survivors, the emotional scars of the atomic bombings were just as real as the physical wounds they had sustained. Survivors faced a deep psychological burden, the trauma of losing loved ones, the horror of the bombings, and the survivor-esque guilt that came from having lived through the devastation, while so many others had perished. The question of why some survived and others did not became a central issue for many survivors. Survivor-esque guilt was often compounded by the long-term emotional trauma of living with the unpredictable and invisible effects of radiation sickness. Even after they had physically survived the initial blast, many lived with a constant fear that radiation would come for them later in life, in the form of cancer, leukemia, or other diseases. This fear added to their sense of powerlessness and anxiety, knowing that there was no way to predict when or if the toll of radiation would finally catch up with them. It was a silent trauma that lingered long after the physical wounds had healed, creating a sense of unresolved grief that could not be easily overcome. For many, the psychological impact of surviving the bombings was compounded by a sense of displacement. Survivors not only lost their homes, families, and communities, but their sense of identity was also shattered. They were no longer the same people they had been before the bombings. The trauma forced them to redefine themselves. How could they move forward in a world that had been permanently altered? For many, there was no return to normal. They had witnessed a new kind of destruction, one that fundamentally changed the course of their lives and the country's history. One of the most powerful ways that survivors of the bombings began to heal was by telling their stories. In the years that followed the bombings, survivors began to speak out about their experiences. They shared their pain, their fears, and their hopes for a better future. In the process, they created a living history of the bombings, one that preserved their memories for future generations. survivor testimony became central to understanding the true human cost of nuclear warfare. The survivors' stories became crucial in the broader peace movement that emerged in the wake of the bombings. Their experiences helped to shape the global dialogue about the need for nuclear disarmament and the abolition of nuclear weapons. Survivors, through their words and their activism, became ambassadors for peace, urging the world to remember the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and to work toward a future where the use of nuclear weapons would never happen again. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, memorials and peace parks were established not just to commemorate the dead, but to remind the world of the living legacy of the atomic bombings. These places became symbols of resilience, hope, and peace. There were places where people could reflect on the horrors of the past, while looking toward a future of reconciliation and understanding. While Japan rebuilt its cities and its people worked to recover from the trauma, the world itself was forced to confront the moral and ethical consequences of nuclear warfare. The atomic bombings were a turning point in human history, an event that forever changed how the world thought about war, weapons, and the possibility of global destruction. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of the perils of nuclear weapons, but they also became symbols of human resilience and hope for peace. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, through their advocacy and their willingness to share their stories, became living witnesses to the horrors of nuclear warfare. Their voices became part of the global conversation about pushing the international community to consider the consequences of developing, using, and proliferating nuclear weapons. The survivors, while bearing the heavy weight of their trauma, worked to ensure that the lessons of the bombings would not be forgotten, that humanity would never again forget the cost of nuclear weapons. The devastation left by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was beyond any prior human experience. It wasn't just the collapse of buildings or the destruction of homes. It was the obliteration of entire lives, of history, of culture. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once thriving cities with rich histories and cultures, were reduced to scorched earth in an instant. The bombings transformed the cities into vast wastelands, with little to no structure left standing. In Hiroshima, the initial devastation was almost total. Residential buildings, businesses, factories, and schools were wiped out in a matter of moments. The landscape of the city was transformed into a surreal scene of twisted metal, charred remnants, and smoke-filled skies. The initial shock of the bombing gave way to a world in which the survivors had to contend with the collapse of everything they had known. There was nothing left for them to return to. The first task for survivors was survival itself, finding shelter, food, and water in a city that had been completely disrupted. The physical process of rebuilding these cities was not simply about restoring buildings and infrastructure. It was about restoring life and community to areas that had been torn apart. Nagasaki faced similar challenges, with much of its industrial base decimated and essential services completely disrupted. For those who survived, the overwhelming question was how to begin again. Where would they go? What would they rebuild first? And most importantly, how could they find the strength to do so when they had already lost so much? The task of rebuilding required not just physical effort, but an immense emotional commitment. Survivors had to wrestle with their own memories of the destruction and loss, as they sought to re-establish their homes and communities. The very idea of normalcy was shattered, and it seemed impossible to ever return to a state of pre-bomb life. Rebuilding became a process of not just reconstructing structures, but reclaiming the sense of self that had been so violently displaced. For survivors, rebuilding was deeply personal. It wasn't just about walls and foundations, but about finding a sense of stability, a new beginning, after a catastrophe that had forever altered the fabric of their lives. The process of physical rebuilding was not merely about restoring the city's former glory. It also involved constructing symbols of resilience and peace. One of the most powerful symbols that emerged from Hiroshima's reconstruction was the Peace Memorial Park. This park, dedicated to those who lost their lives in the bombings, became a focal point for reflection and hope in the years that followed the devastation. At the heart of this memorial is the atomic bomb dome, a structure that, remarkably, survived the explosion despite being located at ground zero. This building, left standing amidst the rubble, became a symbol of resilience. Its skeletal remains represented not only the brutal force of the bomb, but also the determination of the people to rebuild and move forward. Though the building itself was a reminder of the horrors of nuclear war, it also stood as a testament to the city's unbroken will to survive and recover. The Peace Memorial Park, with the atomic bomb dome at its center, has become more than just a place of remembrance. It is a space for reflection and learning, a call to action for peace, and a reminder of the devastating consequences of nuclear weapons. The park's creation was not just a civic effort, but a collective one, a shared endeavor to honor the dead, to care for the survivors, and to make a commitment to future generations that such destruction would never be repeated. In Nagasaki, a similar path was followed in the wake of its destruction. The city also became a symbol of peace, with a focus on global disarmament and reconciliation. Though the bombings left deep scars, Nagasaki's reconstruction reflected a desire to not only rebuild the physical city, but also to engage with the broader world in a conversation about peace and the responsibility of humanity in the nuclear age. As much as the physical act of rebuilding was essential for survival, the emotional and psychological toll of the bombings remained heavy on the survivors. For those who had lived through the horrors of the blasts and the radiation sickness, every brick placed in the new buildings was accompanied by memories of the past, of family members lost, of communities destroyed, and of a way of life that could never be recovered. The pain of loss was ever present. Even as they began to rebuild their homes and cities, survivors had to navigate a complex emotional landscape. For many, rebuilding wasn't just a matter of erecting new structures, but about trying to find a sense of hope in a world where so much had been taken from them. The survivors had to reconcile their grief and trauma with the pressing need to move forward and create a future. There was a constant tug between memory and reconstruction, memories of loved ones lost, of the days before the bombing, and the effort to build something new, a future that would be different from the world they had once known. The survivors often faced a unique emotional burden, the need to rebuild their cities and their lives, while contending with deep, unresolved grief. It was not just about returning to normal, it was about moving forward, not from the past, but alongside it. The trauma they had experienced became interwoven with their daily lives, and their personal stories of loss became part of the nation's collective memory. In the aftermath of the bombings, the Japanese government played a key role in leading the nation's reconstruction efforts. The American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, provided oversight and direction in the rebuilding process, and much of Japan's post-war transformation was guided by policies designed to restore the economy, reform the military, and rebuild public infrastructure. The Marshall Plan, which provided significant financial aid for the reconstruction of war-torn European nations, was also extended to Japan. International aid flowed into Japan, and it was used to rebuild the physical infrastructure, homes, factories, schools, and hospitals. Yet the economic recovery was slow at first. Much of the country's industrial base had been destroyed, and rebuilding these industries required not only financial resources, but also labor and human capital. The Japanese people, scarred by the horrors of war and the devastation of the bombings, had to find new ways of working and new industries in which to engage. Yet, despite these difficulties, Japan experienced remarkable recovery in the years after the war. By the 1950s and 1960s, Japan emerged as an economic powerhouse. A country that had been reduced to rubble now became one of the world's largest and most advanced economies. The resilience of the Japanese people and their ability to rebuild, both physically and emotionally, became an inspiration to the world. The physical and emotional rebuilding of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Japan as a whole was an ongoing process that took years, even decades, to fully accomplish. Yet, despite the unimaginable losses, the people of Japan showed a resilience that was nothing short of extraordinary. While the scars of war would never fully fade, the survivors and the country as a whole found ways to reclaim their hope and humanity. The survivors became living testaments to the strength of the human spirit, demonstrating that, even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, it is possible to rebuild and start again. The rebuilding of Japan after the bombings wasn't just about infrastructure. It was about reclaiming the essence of the nation itself. The creation of memorials, the advocacy for nuclear disarmament, and the dedication to peace were all part of the process of restoring dignity to a nation that had suffered so deeply. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not just cities of destruction, they are cities of resilience. Their stories serve as a reminder to the world that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the will to rebuild and to move forward can carry a people to a future of peace and prosperity. In the aftermath of the bombings, while much of the world focused on the physical reconstruction of Japan, the psychological impact on the survivors was far more profound and complex. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just physical attacks. They were attacks on the very fabric of human existence, leaving deep emotional and psychological scars that would affect the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began their physical reconstruction, the emotional journey of healing was just beginning, and it would prove to be far more challenging and elusive. The survivors, often referred to as the Heat, not only lost their families and homes, but they also had to navigate the overwhelming, emotional aftermath of living through an event of such magnitude. The horrors they experienced were beyond comprehension, and yet they had to face the reality of surviving when so many others did not. This sense of survival, in itself, became a heavy psychological burden that many struggled to reconcile with their continued existence. One of the most poignant and pervasive psychological effects of the atomic bombings was survivors' guilt. The survivors were left with a deep and unrelenting sense of, why me? Why had they survived when so many of their loved ones, friends, and neighbors had perished in an instant? For many, this question haunted their thoughts and hearts, creating an emotional disconnect between the survivors and their world. They often found themselves asking, what was the purpose of my survival? What right do I have to live when so many others didn't have that chance? This guilt was compounded by a sense of displacement. The world they knew was no longer recognizable. Families had been torn apart, communities had been erased, and the landscape itself had been obliterated. The survivors, once part of thriving communities, now found themselves in a world that had been shattered physically, emotionally, and culturally. They had to redefine themselves and their roles in this post-bomb world, all while carrying the weight of their survival. For many survivors, this feeling of guilt became an internalized burden, one that affected not only their psychological state, but also their ability to rebuild their lives. As they worked to restore the physical world around them, they also had to come to terms with the fact that the bombings had left irrevocable marks on their identities and on their relationships with others. Adding to the burden of survivors' guilt was the difficulty of talking about the trauma. Many survivors found it almost impossible to express the depth of their suffering. The horrors they had lived through were so incomprehensible that they feared no one would understand. The emotional weight of the bombings created a deep sense of isolation. Survivors who tried to speak about their experiences often found that others had no words to offer, or worse, they encountered dismissal or avoidance. In Japanese society at the time, there was a cultural reluctance to speak openly about suffering and trauma. The prevailing societal norms emphasized stoicism and resilience, and expressing deep emotional pain was often seen as a weakness. This cultural expectation added another layer of emotional strain on the survivors, who often had to bottle up their feelings in order to conform to societal norms. The burden of unspoken trauma manifested in a range of psychological disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. The survivors not only had to rebuild their external lives, but also grapple with the internal devastation caused by the bombings. For some, the memories of the blast, the searing heat, the radiation, and the immense loss would haunt them for decades to come. As Japan's post-war society began to rebuild, many survivors found a way to begin their emotional healing through storytelling, sharing their personal experiences, recounting the horrors they had witnessed, and discussing their survival became a form of catharsis for the This narrative healing allowed them to process their trauma and start to come to terms with the immense loss and suffering they had experienced. Storytelling served not only as a form of personal release, but also as a method of collective healing for the larger Japanese society. The survivors' accounts began to shape public understanding of the atomic bombings and its lasting effects. For the survivors, sharing their stories was an act of preservation, preserving the history of the bombings and ensuring that the memory of the events would not be lost. It became a way of ensuring that their trauma was not only acknowledged but remembered as part of Japan's collective history. As survivors shared their experiences, they also helped to create a broader national narrative about the atomic bombings. Their stories became a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable horror. The act of telling their stories allowed survivors to reclaim a sense of agency and empowerment, as they shifted from being victims to witnesses and advocates for peace. Their personal accounts formed the backbone of the post-war peace movement, which sought to prevent the use of nuclear weapons and to promote global The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became powerful advocates for nuclear disarmament and global peace. Having lived through the horrors of atomic warfare, they understood better than anyone the devastating consequences of nuclear weapons. Their voices became crucial in shaping the post-war national identity of Japan, as the country struggled to reconcile the horror of the bombings with its new role as a proponent of peace. The survivors' stories were instrumental in shaping Japan's commitment to pacifism, as enshrined in its post-war constitution. Japan's Article 9, which renounces war and the use of force in international disputes, became a symbol of the country's desire to atone for the horrors of the war and to ensure that the use of nuclear weapons would never happen again. The survivors played a significant role in advocating for this peaceful stance, sharing their personal accounts of the bombings and warning future generations about the dangers of nuclear warfare. Through their advocacy for peace, the survivors also helped to build international awareness of the catastrophic consequences of atomic bombs. Their voices became part of the global dialogue on nuclear ensuring that the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not be forgotten. They also created a legacy of humanity and compassion, showing that even in the face of such overwhelming devastation, it is possible to choose hope and work for a better future. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left behind not just physical destruction but also a profound psychological and emotional legacy. For the survivors, the journey of healing was long and difficult, with many facing survivors' guilt and unspoken trauma for years. But through their stories, their courage, and their advocacy, the Hibakusha ensured that the memory of the bombings would not be forgotten, and that the lessons of nuclear disarmament would continue to resonate in global discourse. The survivors' endurance, both physical and emotional, became a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Their ability to move forward, despite the deep scars left by the bombings, remains one of the most powerful stories of survival and resilience in modern history. As Japan rebuilt itself, so too did the survivors begin the long and painful process of rebuilding their emotional lives, all while sharing their experiences to promote a future free of nuclear destruction. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only reshaped the lives of those who experienced them, but also marked a profound turning point in the history of warfare. The introduction of nuclear weapons into the world's military arsenal created a new era, one defined by the potential for unprecedented destruction. Yet, the ramifications of these bombings extended far beyond the immediate devastation. They raised ethical, moral, and philosophical questions that continue to resonate in global discourse to this day. The bomb's legacy became a call for introspection, reflection, and action, urging the world to reconsider the destructive power it had unleashed. As Japan began its arduous process of reconstruction, it was clear that rebuilding the physical cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was only part of the task. The psychological and cultural reconstruction was just as important, if not more so. The atomic bombings had forced the world to confront the devastating consequences of nuclear warfare, and Japan, as the epicenter of this new kind of destruction, found itself at the center of a global conversation about the future of nuclear weapons. In the years that followed the bombings, the survivors, those who had lived through the horror, became the primary witnesses to the cost of atomic warfare. Their voices became a powerful instrument in the global nuclear disarmament movement. As Japan began its recovery, many Hibakusha found themselves compelled to speak out about their experiences. These survivors were not just victims of an unprecedented military action. They were the living witnesses to the horrors that nuclear weapons could unleash. Their testimony became a crucial part of the global peace movement, as they worked to ensure that the devastation they had lived through would never be repeated. These survivors were determined to turn their personal pain and loss into action, striving to raise awareness about the dangers of nuclear weapons and advocating for their abolition. The survivors' stories carried a unique and profound weight and emotional depth born from their first-hand experiences. By sharing their personal accounts, they helped humanize the often abstract political debates surrounding nuclear weapons. Their experiences conveyed not just the immediate horrors of the bombings, but also the long-term impact on their lives, health, and families. They spoke of the invisible scars of radiation, the deep sense of loss, and the lingering fear of further devastation. Through these personal narratives, survivors communicated the human cost of nuclear war, transforming it from an abstract concept into a deeply personal, emotional reality that resonated with people across the globe. The survivors' advocacy for peace did not just focus on remembrance, it was a call for action. Their testimony, combined with the emotional weight of their experiences, fueled the global campaign for nuclear disarmament. It became clear that the atomic bombings had not only destroyed cities, but also disrupted the very fabric of humanity. The survivors, through their stories, called for a reimagining of the future, one in which nuclear weapons would no longer have the power to destroy civilizations and humanity itself. The survivors' advocacy played a central role in shaping Japan's post-war identity. The country, once a belligerent empire, now became a symbol of pacifism and non-violence. In 1947, Japan's constitution was amended to include Article 9, which renounced war and the use of military force in settling international disputes. This commitment to peace was not only symbolic, it reflected the lived reality of the survivors, who had experienced the destructive power of war firsthand, and were dedicated to ensuring that such destruction would never happen again. On the international stage, the survivors' stories became integral to the movement for global disarmament. In the 1950s and 1960s, activists, scientists, and politicians from around the world began to engage with Japan's unique perspective on nuclear weapons. The survivors' voices helped shape the global discourse around the dangers of nuclear proliferation and led to international treaties aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear arms, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in 1968. The survivors, though they had suffered immensely, were now part of a larger global effort to ensure that the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not be repeated. In both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, memorials were built not only as places of remembrance, but as powerful statements of peace. These memorials became spaces for reflection, healing, and education, places where visitors could learn about the horrors of nuclear war, while also reflecting on the potential for peace in the future. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, in particular, became a central gathering place for survivors, as well as visitors from around the world. The atomic bomb dome, left standing as a symbol of the destruction, became one of the most recognizable landmarks of the 20th century. The park's peaceful surroundings, marked by beautiful gardens and monuments, offered a place for survivors to mourn, reflect, and share their stories with visitors. The park was not just a memorial, it was a call to action, urging people worldwide to reflect on the past and work for a future without nuclear weapons. Similarly, in Nagasaki, the Nagasaki Peace Park became a symbol of the city's commitment to peace. Both parks played vital roles in educating future generations about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of The survivors themselves often took part in guided tours and lectures, sharing their personal stories with international visitors. These efforts helped solidify the survivors' legacies as not just witnesses to destruction, but also as powerful voices for global peace. While the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continued to grapple with their personal losses, they remained steadfast in their commitment to peace. Their advocacy led to the establishment of peace organizations, both in Japan and internationally, dedicated to the abolition of nuclear weapons. They worked with activists, politicians, and scientists around the world to raise awareness about the dangers of nuclear proliferation and the need for global Through their efforts, the survivors not only helped shape Japan's national identity, but also contributed to the broader global conversation about the morality of nuclear weapons. Their stories, passed down through generations, became an integral part of the historical record, helping future generations understand the true cost of war and the necessity of peace. Their activism had far-reaching effects, contributing to the founding of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons in 2007, which eventually led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. Through their continued advocacy, helped make it clear that the atomic bombings were not just an event in history, but a moral imperative to end the possibility of nuclear war. The legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not one of just destruction, but of resilience, reconciliation, and commitment to peace. The survivors of these cities transformed their unimaginable suffering into a message of hope, a call for peace that resonates to this day. Their advocacy has not only shaped Japan's post-war identity, but has influenced global efforts for nuclear disarmament and peace. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors' stories continue to echo in the efforts for a future free from nuclear weapons. Their personal sacrifices and resilience serve as a testament to the enduring human spirit and the desire to create a world in which the horrors of the atomic bombings will never be repeated. The survivors, through their efforts, continue to inspire future generations to work for a world in which peace is not just a dream, but a lasting reality. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore the weight of an unimaginable burden, one that transcended the immediate destruction caused by the atomic bombings. The physical reconstruction of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was an extensive, demanding task that consumed much of the early post-war years. Yet, as daunting as the rebuilding of buildings and infrastructure was, the deeper work rebuilding the human spirit was far more complex and prolonged. The destruction of the bomb was not just a physical annihilation, but a psychological and cultural rupture. the survivors to grapple with a new and vastly altered reality. The survivors, each one a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, began a journey not just of survival but of recovery, and their stories have continued to shape not only the future of Japan, but also the global conversation on nuclear disarmament and peace. From the ashes of utter devastation, they rebuilt not only their cities but also their identities, their communities, and their very sense of self. Their determination to live, to rebuild, and to advocate for peace amidst such incomprehensible loss is a reflection of the strength of the human will to endure and overcome even the darkest of times. The survivors' stories transcend the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. From the moment the bombs fell, the survivors were not only witnesses to history, they became its custodians. Their testimonies, though steeped in grief and loss, also serve as beacons of hope and advocacy for future generations. As they survived and rebuilt, the survivors also took on the role of advocates for peace, becoming a voice of reason in the global dialogue about nuclear weapons. Their involvement in the nuclear disarmament movement was pivotal. While Japan's government, in the aftermath of the war, worked toward rebuilding the nation, the survivors, through their shared trauma, became vocal champions for peace and global They were living, breathing reminders of the horrors that nuclear weapons could unleash, and they dedicated their lives to ensuring that no other country would suffer the same fate. Their efforts spurred global efforts to prevent nuclear warfare, helping to foster international agreements such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and later the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The survivors' advocacy efforts, driven by personal loss and pain, became an indispensable part of global peace initiatives. They made it clear that the effects of nuclear warfare were not only immediate but also deeply enduring. Through decades of public speaking, education, and testimony, survivors ensured that the world would never forget the cost of atomic warfare. They didn't just speak of the horrors of their past, they warned of the future consequences of nuclear arms, ensuring their voices were heard at international forums, peace conferences, and disarmament talks. One of the most profound ways in which the survivors contributed to the healing process was through the establishment of memorials and peace parks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These sites are not just places of remembrance, they are symbols of the survivors' commitment to peace and global understanding. Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park and Nagasaki's Nagasaki Peace Park became central gathering places for survivors and visitors alike, places where the cost of war could be reflected upon and the spirit of peace could be honored. The Atomic Bomb Dome, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, stands as a testament to the strength of the people of Hiroshima. The building, once caught in the blast, remains a solemn reminder of the devastation that nuclear war brought to the city. In Nagasaki, the Nagasaki Peace Park offers a place for both the survivors and future generations to reflect on the horrors of war and the importance of nuclear These memorials do not just memorialize the victims, they serve as calls to action, urging those who visit to consider the future of the world as nuclear policies and to commit themselves to a world free of nuclear weapons. The atomic bombings not only reshaped the survivors' lives, but also fundamentally transformed Japan's national identity. The nation, devastated by war and reeling from the effects of the bombings, found itself on a new path not of revenge or retribution, but of peace and reconciliation. As Japan rebuilt, the survivors' voices became an integral part of the national narrative. Their lived experiences shaped the country's post-war policies, including the enshrining of Article 9 in Japan's constitution, which renounced the use of military force to resolve international disputes. Japan's commitment to peace and its advocacy for nuclear disarmament were directly influenced by the stories of These survivors not only contributed to the healing of their own country, but also helped to reshape Japan's global role, transforming it from a militarized nation into a leading advocate for pacifism and nonviolence. The survivors' personal stories were not just about the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They became a moral compass for Japan's future, a guiding force in its decision to embrace a path of non-aggression and peace-building. The emotional scars carried by the hibakusha were not just personal burdens, they were woven into the fabric of Japan's collective memory, helping to create a future where war and nuclear weapons were viewed not as tools of power, but as horrific last resorts that could never be allowed again. As survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continued to advocate for peace, their message reached far beyond Japan's borders. Through their powerful personal accounts, they influenced international discourse on nuclear weapons, urging world leaders to consider the human cost of nuclear warfare. Their efforts were instrumental in sparking global debates on the morality of nuclear weapons and their potential to annihilate civilizations. The survivors' stories helped to shape nuclear policy, leading to the formation of organizations like the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which eventually contributed to the adoption of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. Their voices have been part of an ongoing conversation about the dangers of nuclear proliferation, and their commitment to a world free of nuclear arms remains a legacy that continues to inspire global peace movements. Through their endurance, advocacy, and commitment to peace, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki turned their pain into a powerful message to the world. They have shown that even in the darkest times, hope can emerge, hope for a future in which humanity chooses dialogue and understanding over destruction. Their resilience is a testament to the power of survival, but more importantly, it is a reminder of the humanity that transcends even the most tragic of circumstances. As the world faces the continued threat of nuclear weapons, the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki serves as a constant reminder of the cost of such weapons. The survivors' stories, the memorials, and the peace movements they helped build all call for future generations to learn from the past and to work towards a world where nuclear weapons are never used again. The survivors, through their sacrifice, their pain, and their advocacy, have left a profound legacy of hope, peace, and the unyielding belief that humanity can choose a better future. The scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki may never fully fade, but through the resilience of the survivors, their memory continues to inspire a world that chooses peace over destruction. Their legacy lives on, not just in the hearts of those who survived, but in the collective conscience of the world, urging us all to remember the true cost of war and the importance of never forgetting the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.